The wind had a voice in this part of the Idaho Territory, a low, keening sound that scraped its way through the lodgepole pines clothing Antler Mesa. It was the sound of an ending, the final, mournful breath of autumn giving way to the iron grip of winter. Snow, thin as a layer of sifted flour, dusted the vast, silent expanse of Cinder Valley and clung to the rough-hewn steps of the log cabin that was now, by law and by a stranger's mercy, her home. The wagon ride from Copper Vale had been conducted in a near-total silence, broken only by the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves, the squeak of the wagon wheels, and that ceaseless, searching wind. Thorne Ellison drove the team with a quiet competence, his hands gloved in worn leather, holding the reins with a steadiness that seemed to be the very core of his nature. He hadn't pressed her for conversation, hadn't filled the air with the pointless chatter of a man unused to quiet. He seemed to live in it, to be carved from the very same resilient, stoic material as the mountains that loomed over them, their peaks already shrouded in a heavy cap of white. Now, inside the cabin, the silence was different. It was denser, heavier, filled with the unspoken questions that hung in the air like wood smoke. Maris Calder? No, Maris Ellison. She had to remember that now sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were pale, bloodless knobs. The room was spare, functional, and overwhelmingly masculine. A single bed with a sturdy pine frame, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, a small table with 2 chairs, and a tall wardrobe. Everything was clean, meticulously so, but it was the cleanliness of solitude, of a life lived without the softening touch of a woman. It smelled of pine, old leather, and the faint, clean scent of the lye soap he must use. The dress she wore was not her own. It had been loaned to her by the circuit judge's wife, a woman with a kind face and pitying eyes. It was made of ivory-colored wool, simple and unadorned, but it was already starting to feel like a costume, the fabric a testament to a life she wasn't living and a role she didn't know how to play. It was yellowed slightly at the collar and cuffs, a garment that had seen another woman's happy day and was now bearing witness to her desperate one. In her small satchel, resting by the door, was the marriage license, signed less than an hour ago in the dusty office in Copper Vale. The ink, she imagined, was likely still damp, a dark, official stain binding her to the silent man who was now her husband. She heard the solid thud of his boots on the porch, followed by the sound of him stamping the snow from them. The door opened, letting in a swirl of frigid air that made the flame in the oil lamp on the table dance wildly. Thorne Ellison stepped inside, bringing the cold and the scent of the coming night with him. He was not a tall man, but he was built with a breadth of shoulder and a solidness of frame that spoke of a life of hard, physical labor. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a landscape of quiet severity, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He was a widower, the judge had told her, his wife taken by a fever 2 years prior. He had lived here alone since, running his horse ranch with a single-minded focus that was respected throughout the valley. He closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality that echoed in the small room. Without looking at her, he moved to the wooden pegs beside the door and hung up his heavy sheepskin coat and his wide-brimmed felt hat. Each movement was deliberate, economical, stripped of any unnecessary flourish. He was a man who didn't waste motion, or words. He moved like someone accustomed to living with silence, who had learned to make it a companion rather than an enemy. Maris watched him, her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. This was it. This was the moment where the reality of her bargain would settle upon her. This marriage was a shield, nothing more. A legal fortress built of his name and his reputation, designed to protect her from the accusations that had chased her from the mining town of Tin Lantern, from the looming threat of a wrongful arrest and the ruinous whispers that followed a woman alone and undefended. She needed his name, the solid, respectable weight of it, to stand between her and the lawman. Hollis Baird, who seemed so determined to see her in a cell. Thorne turned from the coat pegs, and his eyes finally met hers. They held no judgment, no expectation, only a quiet, assessing gaze. He saw her perched on the edge of his bed, a stranger in a borrowed wedding dress, her fear a palpable thing in the air between them. The silence stretched, pulled taut, and Maris knew she had to be the one to break it, to give voice to the inadequacy that was choking her. Her voice, when it came, was a thread of sound, barely audible above the crackle of the fire he must have lit before they left for town. "I don't know how to be a wife." The words hung there, a confession of her own insufficiency. She knew what the term implied: cooking and cleaning, mending and tending, warming his bed and bearing his children. She knew how to work. Her hands were calloused from long hours in a saloon kitchen, but she knew nothing of the intimacies of this new life, of the soft, unspoken duties of a married woman. Thorne held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't smile, but the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, just slightly. He took a step toward the fireplace, turning his body so he was no longer facing her directly, a gesture that eased the intensity of the confrontation. "Then just lie down and love me," he said. His voice was low, rough-edged like river gravel, but the words were not a command. They were not the words of a husband demanding his rights. They were an invitation, a release. He wasn't asking her to perform a role, to act out a part she hadn't learned. He was offering a simpler, more fundamental instruction, a way to begin. He was telling her to set aside the title, the expectations, the fear of failure, and to simply be present with him in this room, in this moment. Lie down, a call to rest, to find sanctuary, and love me. A plea for a connection that went deeper than a list of duties, a request for the warmth of another human being against the cold loneliness of the world. It was the most compassionate directive she had ever been given. He didn't wait for a reply, as if sensing she needed time to absorb his meaning. He pulled one of the wooden chairs closer to the hearth and sat down, his back partially to her. He reached for a book on the mantelpiece, its leather cover worn smooth and its spine frayed from countless readings. It was a Bible. He opened it on his knee, the pages falling open to a familiar passage. But he didn't read. His head was bowed, his gaze directed at the flickering flames, his large, capable hands resting on the open book. He was giving her space. He was giving her the gift of his quiet, unassuming presence, a silent promise that he would not rush her, would not force her. The fire popped and hissed, spitting a shower of orange sparks against the stone. The flames cast his shadow, large and steady, against the pine-planked wall. His shoulders were a solid, unmoving line, a bastion against the howling wind outside. In the quiet rhythm of his breathing, deep and even, Maris heard a form of reassurance more potent than any spoken words. He was here. He was calm. He was safe. Slowly, as if moving through water, she reached down and pulled back the heavy wool blankets on the bed. They were layered thick against the bitter Idaho cold. The linen sheets beneath were cool and smelled faintly of cedar from the chest at the foot of the bed. She slipped out of her sturdy walking boots and slid under the covers, the borrowed dress rustling around her. A shudder ran through her, a tremor that was born half of the chill in the room and half of a profound, dizzying sense of relief. For the first time since she'd fled Tin Lantern, she had made a choice that wasn't simply about running. It was about standing still, about accepting shelter. The choice itself was a small, fragile warmth inside her. She lay there for a long time, listening to the fire and the wind and the soft rustle of the pages as Thorne idly turned them without reading. Finally, she heard the soft snap of the Bible closing. The chair scraped quietly against the floorboards as he stood. She held her breath, her muscles tensing. He moved not to the bed, but to the oil lamp, and turned the wick down until the flame sputtered and died, plunging the room into the soft, flickering gloom of the firelight. In the dimness, She saw his shape move toward the bed. He didn't remove his trousers or his shirt, only his boots, which he set down with a quiet thud. Then he lay down on top of the blankets beside her. He didn't touch her. He lay on his back, his hands laced behind his head, a dark, solid shape in the fire-cast shadows. The space between them was only a few inches, but it felt as vast and as sacred as a church aisle. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a welcome warmth that seeped through the layers of wool. She could feel the bed shift and settle under his weight. He was a wall between her and the cold of the room, a living, breathing barrier. The steady, powerful rise and fall of his chest was a rhythm she could anchor herself to in the swirling uncertainty of her new life. It was a second blanket, a weightier, warmer assurance than the wool. It was the sound of life, of strength held in reserve, of a quiet promise to protect. He had offered her his name, his home, and now he was offering her his peace. Maris closed her eyes, the frantic bird in her chest finally settling. The fear had not vanished, but it had receded, beaten back by the simple, profound decency of this stranger she had married. He had asked her to lie down and love him, and she understood now that love, in this house, might not be a matter of grand passion or poetic words. It might be something quieter, sturdier. It might be the shared warmth in a cold room, the comfort of a steady breath beside you in the dark, the unspoken promise to stand as a shield against the world's harsh winds. In the quiet, with the fire murmuring its soft song and the steady heartbeat of her husband, a low, constant drum beside her, a thought, fragile and new, began to form in Maris's mind. It was not a thought of duty or obligation. It was a quiet, tentative desire to learn not how to be a wife, but how to give this man, this anchor in her storm, the very thing he had asked for. In the stillness, a longing to learn how to love for the very first time began to kindle 3 months earlier. The sun over the Bristle Ridge desert was a physical force, a hammer of white-hot light that beat down on the parched, red earth. It bleached the sky to a pale, washed-out blue and baked the life out of everything that wasn't tough enough or mean enough to survive it. Maris had left the mining town of Tin Lantern with that same sun at her back, the heat, a relentless pressure pushing her forward. She didn't look back. There was nothing to see but the black, skeletal remains of the saloon storehouse, a jagged wound against the horizon, still weeping thin tendrils of greasy smoke into the unforgiving air. She walked until the town was a mere shimmer on the horizon, a bad memory dissolving in the heat. In the rough canvas satchel slung over her shoulder, amidst a spare dress, a half loaf of bread, and a small tin of water, was the reason she was running. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with the spidery script of her former employer, the late and unlamented Jebediah Finch. It was the saloon's accounts book, a catalog of debts and credits, of whiskey sold and wages paid. She'd grabbed it in the frantic, smoke-choked moments of the fire, not out of any loyalty to old Jebediah, but because her own meager savings were recorded in the back pages. Only later, miles down a dusty track, had she discovered its true worth and its true danger. Tucked into the columns detailing shipments of flour and barrels of beer were other, stranger entries, shipments of cattle, far more than the saloon would ever need for its kitchen, were listed alongside deliveries of blasting powder. And next to these specific entries, in a faint, spiky pencil script that was not Jebediah's, were cryptic notations, a date, a location like Coyote Switch or Widow's Creek, and a small, barely perceptible symbol, a tiny triangle with a line through it. The blasting powder was explained away as supplies for local prospectors, but the quantity was staggering. And the cattle, that made no sense at all. They were ghosts in the ledger, phantom herds passing through the saloon's books on their way to some unknown destination. Maris knew, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the desert night, that this ledger was the reason the storehouse had burned. Someone hadn't just wanted to destroy supplies, they had wanted to turn this book to ash. Her flight had not been aimless. She was heading for Copper Vale, a larger town with a stagecoach line that could take her west, to the coast, to a place where a woman with a strong back and a quiet mouth could disappear. But trouble, she was learning, had longer legs than a lone woman on foot. In Copper Vale, she heard the whispers. A fire in Tin Lantern. A woman seen fleeing the scene. The town's new marshal, Hollis Baird, was asking questions. He was a man with a hard, square jaw and the kind of pale, righteous eyes that saw the world in stark black and white, with no room for shades of gray. The official story, as it filtered through the gossip of the town, was that Marshal Baird had an anonymous witness who claimed to have seen Maris leaving the storehouse just moments before the first flames were spotted. The charge he was building was arson. A convenient charge, Maris thought bitterly. It required no complex motive, no deep investigation, a disgruntled kitchen worker, a spark in a pile of oily rags. It was a simple, ugly story that a jury would readily believe. It painted her as the villain and, more importantly, it neatly concluded the inquiry. It stopped anyone from asking more difficult questions, like why a saloon storehouse would be holding enough blasting powder to level half the town. It was in the Blue Bottle Saloon in Copper Vale, a dingy place that smelled of stale beer and desperation, that her path had irrevocably changed. She had been nursing a small beer, trying to make it last, when a commotion near the door drew her attention. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and his clothes coated in the fine red dust of the trail, had stumbled through the bat-wing doors and collapsed, his leg twisting under him at an unnatural angle. He was a mail rider, one of the tough, wiry men who crisscrossed the territory on horseback, their saddlebags filled with the hopes and sorrows of 100 lonely souls. The saloon's patrons had stared. A few had snickered, but no one had moved to help. Maris, acting on an instinct she hadn't realized she possessed, had gone to him. She'd knelt in the sawdust and grime, tearing a strip from her spare petticoat to fashion a crude splint for his clearly broken knee. She'd given him water from her own canteen and coaxed him into a chair, her voice low and calm. His mind was a broken thing, shattered by the fall or by a lifetime of solitude and sun. His memory came and went in fits and starts, like a faulty lantern. He'd stare at her with vacant eyes one moment, then his gaze would clear and he would speak, his words a jumble of disconnected fragments. But in that jumble, Maris had heard names and phrases that made the hair on her arms stand on end. He spoke of a man named Silas Bray, a man who called himself a railroad inspector, but who, the old rider cackled, ain't never laid eyes on a railroad tie he didn't want to sell for firewood. Bray, the old man whispered, had a talent for creating documents, grazing permits, mining claims, land deeds all forged with an artist's skill. He'd flash them at small ranchers and homesteaders, confusing and intimidating them, buying their land for pennies on the dollar before the real railroad surveyors ever arrived. Then, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial mumble, he'd spoken of a hidden cache, a devil's pantry of blasting powder, buried somewhere near a place called Creekside Narrows. He connected it to a series of accidents that had plagued the valley over the last year, a rock slide that had destroyed a homesteader's cabin, a flash flood that had mysteriously wiped out another man's herd, a mine shaft that had collapsed, killing a prospector who had refused to sell his claim. Each accident had served to drive people from their land that was then snapped up by a faceless holding company represented by Silas Bray. The old man had gripped her arm, his eyes suddenly lucid and filled with a desperate urgency. "He's cleaning the books," he'd rasped, "burning the ledgers." Before he could say more, his eyes had glazed over again, and he'd slumped back in his chair, lost once more in the fog of his broken mind. The next morning, the old man was gone. The saloon owner claimed he'd simply wandered off in the night, but tucked into the cushions of the chair where he had sat, Maris found something he had left behind. It was a small, star-shaped badge, cast from cheap tin, the kind a man might buy for his son at a county fair. It wasn't a marshal's badge or a sheriff's. It was something else, something unofficial. And on its tarnished surface was a small, dark smear of what looked like dried blood. In that moment, standing in the gloom of the Blue Bottle Saloon, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The ledger in her bag, Silas Bray, the forged permits, the accidents, the blasting powder, the fire. She was not just a random victim of circumstance. She was a loose end, a scapegoat, the real culprits. The men who were stealing this valley piece by piece needed someone to blame for the fire that was meant to destroy the evidence of their crimes. They had chosen her. The anonymous witness was a lie, a fabrication to give Marshall Baird the legal justification he needed to hunt her down. She was the perfect target, a woman alone, a transient with no family and no one to speak for her. Panic, cold and sharp, had seized her. She had to run, but not just to the next town. She needed more than distance. She needed sanctuary. She needed someone whose word was strong enough to stand against a marshal's accusation, whose reputation was a shield. Her mind had snagged on a conversation she'd overheard in the Coppervale Mercantile. Two women had been talking about a rancher, a man who had provided fresh horses to a family whose team had given out on the trail and had refused any payment. One of the women, the blacksmith's wife, a formidable woman with soot-stained hands and a direct, honest gaze, had said, "That's Thorne Ellison for you. He's a man who puts his honor above any rumor." Honor, the word had resonated with Maris. It was a currency she had little experience with, but she knew it was the only thing that could save her now. Following the blacksmith's wife's directions, she had walked the long miles out to the Ellison Ranch in Cinder Valley, the red dust coating her shoes and the ledger in her bag feeling heavier with every step. She had found him in his corral, working with a young, half-wild Mustang. He moved with a quiet, patient grace, his voice a low murmur as he calmed the frightened animal. He had listened to her story without interruption, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her face, never wavering. She had told him everything, the fire, the ledger, the old mail rider, Silas Bray, Marshall Baird. She had expected disbelief, suspicion, perhaps even pity. She had received none of them. When she had finished, her voice hoarse, the silence had stretched out, filled only by the soft snorting of the horse and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Thorne had given the Mustang a final pat, his gaze still on Maris. His face was unreadable, a mask carved from weathered oak. Then he had spoken, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the price of hay. "Marshall Baird is a stubborn man, but he's not a fool. He won't risk his reputation on the word of a single, unnamed witness if the accused has powerful friends. He'll need more than whispers to come onto my land and arrest my wife." The word had struck her like a physical blow. Wife. He had seen the shock in her eyes and had continued, his tone devoid of any sentimentality. "It's a business arrangement, a contract. I give you my name, my protection. In return, you stay. This is a lonely place for one man." He had paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent cabin, the empty corrals, the vast, beautiful, and empty valley. "You'll be safe here. No one's putting an Ellison's wife in jail on the strength of a rumor." It was a desperate, insane proposal, to bind herself to a stranger, to trade one kind of prison for another. But as she looked at him, at the quiet strength in his stance, the unyielding integrity in his eyes, she knew it was the only choice she had. His offer was not one of passion, but of principle. It was an offer of sanctuary, a shield forged not of love, but of honor. She had asked only one thing. "When this is over," she had said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "when my name is cleared, I must be free to go." It was not a question, but a statement of terms, the final clause in their unwritten contract. She was accepting his protection, but not surrendering her future. Thorne Ellison had looked at her for a long, considering moment, his gray eyes seeming to see straight through to the core of her. to the resilient, unbroken spirit that had carried her this far. He had seen not a criminal, not a victim, but a survivor. Then he had given a single, sharp nod. And with that silent, solemn gesture, the bargain had been struck. The rhythm of the house was set by the sun, but its pulse began in the pre-dawn dark. Maris would wake not to an alarm, but to a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The first sign of life was the sound. A metallic shur-shur, shur-shur from the barn. The rhythmic scrape of a rasp against hoof. Thorn was always up first, tending to his horses, his most sacred duty. By the time her eyes adjusted to the gloom, the second sign would arrive, the scent of pine resin and scorching coffee. He would have already come back inside, silent as a shadow, to start the fire in the hearth. The kindling would catch, a small, hopeful crackle, and he would set the heavy metal pot of coffee grounds and water directly on the stones to boil. He liked it strong, thick, and slightly burnt, a flavor she was beginning to associate with the profound, quiet safety of the morning. He would be gone again, back to the barn, before she fully rose and slipped out from under the heavy wool blankets. The cabin would be blessedly warm, the firelight pushing back the cold. Gray light of the Idaho dawn. This was their arrangement, their unspoken domestic treaty. He handled the world outside the cabin, the stock, the wood pile, the heavy repairs, and she handled the world within. She had found a peg near the washstand for her apron. It was a deep, plum-colored wool, one of the few items she'd managed to buy for herself in tin lantern. Hanging it up each morning was a small ritual, a signal that the day's work was beginning. Her work was a language she understood, a comfort in its repetition. She would put a pot of beans, soaked overnight in cold water, on to simmer for their supper. She would mix the sourdough starter, her hands learning the feel of the dough, the exact amount of flour needed to counter the mountain air's humidity. And she would find tasks to make the cabin theirs, rather than just his. One of these tasks was the back door's hinge. It screamed every time it was opened, a high, metallic shriek that set her teeth on edge. It was the sound of neglect, a sound that didn't fit with the rest of Thorne's meticulous, orderly world. She had tried oiling it with bacon fat, but the cold had simply congealed it into a useless white paste. One afternoon, while Thorne was miles away checking fence lines, she took a small tin, walked to the barn, and scraped a dollop of the thick, black grease he used for the wagon axles. Back in the cabin, she worked the grease into the joint, forcing the pin up and down until the screaming subsided into a dull, satisfied groan, and finally into a whisper. When Thorne returned that evening, he'd used the door, and his step had faltered for just a fraction of a second. He'd glanced at the hinge, then at her, and had given a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the thanks she needed. Their conversation was built of such nods, of gestures and shared tasks. Words were expensive. They were used only when absolutely necessary. But actions, she was learning, spoke with a clarity that words often lacked. This lesson was driven home by the matter of her boots. They were her only pair, worn thin from her walk from tin lantern. The soles cracked and the heels run down. The cold, wet snow of the valley seeped in through the split leather, soaking her stockings and chilling her to the bone. She worried about them constantly, knowing that if they failed, she was effectively crippled. One morning, she left them by the hearth to dry, the damp leather steaming in the heat. When she returned from the larder, they were gone. A cold, sharp panic, the old fear of the hunted, seized her. Had he taken them? Was this a sign, a silent message that his patience with their arrangement was wearing thin? She scanned the small cabin, her heart hammering. They were nowhere. She said nothing all day, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She cooked supper, her movements stiff and worried. He came in as dusk fell, stamping the snow from his own boots. He placed a package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, on the table. And then he went to the washstand to clean his hands, his back to her. Maris stared at the package. When he turned back, he motioned to it with his chin. "From the barn," he said, as if that explained anything. She fumbled with the twine, her fingers clumsy. Inside were her boots, but they were transformed. The cracked, failing soles were gone, replaced by thick, new leather, the kind she recognized from his saddle-making tools. The stitching was deep and precise, each hole perfectly aligned, each thread pulled taut with an expert all's strength. He had used his best saddle leather to mend the shoes of a woman who was his wife in name only. She looked up at him, her throat thick, the words of gratitude hopelessly tangled. She was overwhelmed by the intimacy of the act that he had held her worn boots in his hands, measured them, and spent hours of his time meticulously repairing them. It was a gesture of profound, practical care. Thorne saw the unshed tears in her eyes, the conflict on her face. He saw her struggle for words and, in a now familiar act of grace, spared her the necessity of finding them. He cleared his throat and walked to the door, gesturing to the gray, snow-heavy sky. "Weather's turning. We'll need to do the laundry tomorrow. The creek will be too high by the end of the week." He picked up the empty wood ash bucket from beside the hearth. "I'll show you how to draw the lye water. It's best done while the ashes are still warm." He didn't mention the boots. Not then, not ever. Instead, he simply moved to the next task, the next rhythm of their shared life, teaching her how to pour boiling water over the hardwood ash in a barrel, how to test the strength of the amber-colored lye water that dripped out the bottom by seeing if a chicken feather would dissolve in it. He was teaching her a skill, anchoring her to this new life, and in doing so, he had accepted her silent, unvoiced thanks. The first trip to Coppervale as Mrs. Ellison was a trial by fire. As they drove the wagon down the main street, Maris felt the stairs like a physical weight. The town was a collection of whispers, and she was their subject. "That's her," a woman muttered from the boardwalk, her voice carrying clearly on the cold air. "The one from Tin Lantern," another, standing outside the mercantile, whispered to her companion. "That's Ellison's new wife. A quick thing. Heard it's just an arrangement, for protection." Maris felt her shoulders hunch, her instinct to become invisible, to run, surging up. She kept her eyes fixed on the wagon bed, her hands clutching her satchel. Thorne, seemingly oblivious, pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the mercantile. He helped her down, his hand a firm, impersonal grip on her elbow, and then tethered the horses. Inside, the pot-bellied stove radiated a welcome heat, but the atmosphere was frigid. The shopkeeper, a man whose gaze slid past her as if she wasn't there, greeted Thorne with a strained heartiness. "Mr. Ellison, cold one." "It is," Thorne replied, his voice even. He turned to Maris. "What do you need for the cabin?" She felt the eyes of the other customers on her back. She kept her voice low, reciting her list. "Flour, salt, a side of bacon, and some of that plum-colored thread, if you have it." As the shopkeeper turned to weigh the flour, a woman standing nearby, Mrs. Peabody, the town's foremost gossip, leaned toward her friend. "Not a real wife, I hear," she said, her voice a stage whisper designed to be overheard. "Just a bargain to keep the marshal off her. Shameful, really. What some women will do." Maris flinched as if struck. The color drained from her face. Before she could react, before the panic could swallow her, Thorne moved. He had been standing by the counter examining harness buckles, but now he was directly behind her. So close, she could feel the warmth of his body through her coat. He was not looking at Mrs. Peabody. He was looking at the shopkeeper, who had frozen, his scoop halfway into the flour barrel. "Mr. Abernathy," Thorne said, his voice not loud but low and resonant, a rumble that cut through the entire store. "My wife is waiting on her flour." He paused, then added, his gaze still fixed on the shopkeeper but his words aimed like a rifle. And tell Mrs. Peabody. I don't like that tone, especially not when it's attached to my wife's name. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Mrs. Peabody's face turned a mottled, furious red. The shopkeeper suddenly bustled with activity. Yes, sir, Mr. Ellison. Right away, sir. He filled the bag, his hands shaking slightly, and refused to meet anyone's eyes. Thorne had not threatened anyone. He had not raised his voice. He had simply stated a fact and, in doing so, had drawn a line in the sand as clear as a barbed wire fence. He had claimed her, publicly and indisputably. The incident with the mine hand was different, but the result was the same. They were leaving the blacksmith's shop, Maris carrying a newly repaired skillet, when a group of rough-looking men, their clothes stained with the yellow mud of the diggings, loitered outside the saloon. As she passed, one of them, a big man with a tangle of red beard, put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a long, low whistle, a sound that was both an appraisal and an insult. Maris froze, the old, familiar terror of being a woman alone and undefended washing over her. Thorne didn't stop walking, but he did turn his head. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for the pistol on his hip. He simply looked at the man. His gaze was level, cold, and utterly flat. It was the look of a man assessing a lame horse, deciding its fate. He held the look for 3 long, silent seconds. The miner's smirk faltered. His friends grew quiet, and he finally broke eye contact, looking down at his boots and shuffling his feet. Thorne said nothing. He placed a hand on the small of Maris's back, a light, guiding pressure, and steered her toward the wagon. The next morning, when he went to the town livery to speak to the owner about a new team of draft horses, Maris, who had waited in the wagon, overheard the end of their conversation. Can't have that kind of element stabling here, the livery owner was saying, wringing his hands. Ellison, he made it clear he won't do business with anyone who rents to that crew, said they forgot their manners. Bad for my reputation. You see, they're gone. Won't be back. Thorne had used his influence, his economic weight in the valley, as a weapon. He had protected her, not with a fist or a gun, but with his reputation. He had made her untouchable. This protection extended to his teaching. He decided she needed to learn to ride properly, not just sit perched on a wagon seat. He chose a horse for her from his string, a calm, gray mare named Sage. She'll test you, he said, but she won't hurt you. His lessons were as practical and unsentimental as his mending. Heels down, sit deep, look where you're going, not at the horse's head. She was awkward, afraid of the animal's size and power. On the second day, Sage shied at a rabbit, and Maris, tense and unbalanced, tumbled off, landing in a dusty, undignified heap. She lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of her, humiliation stinging more than the fall. She expected him to laugh, or to yell at her for her clumsiness. He did neither. He just stood there, holding Sage's reins, his expression unchanged. You're fine, he stated. Get up. She got up, brushing the dust from her skirt, her face burning. Again! She fell twice that day. The second time, she landed in a patch of half-frozen mud. Frustration and tears pricked her eyes. This time, he walked over and offered her his hand. His grip was strong, calloused, and pulled her to her feet with an effortless strength. He didn't smile. He just pointed to the stirrup. You're gripping with your knees. Stop fighting her. Let her move under you. She got back on, and by the end of the week, she was trotting a small circle around the corral, her posture still stiff, but her fear replaced by a fragile, budding confidence. He stood in the center, watching, and when she finally dismounted on her own, her legs trembling, he gave her that same small nod. Good, he said. Tomorrow, we'll ride to the creek. The truce between them, the quiet compact of their life, was sealed one evening over a ruined supper. It was her turn to bake the cornbread in the cast-iron spider skillet, setting it directly in the coals of the hearth. She'd been distracted, mending one of his shirts, and had forgotten it. The smell of burning bread filled the cabin. She rushed to pull it out, but it was too late. The bottom was a thick, black crust of charcoal. "It's ruined," she said, her voice thick with frustration. It was a stupid, simple mistake, but it felt like a failure. Thorn took the skillet from her. He carried it to the table, took his knife, and began to expertly crack and peel away the blackened bottom, revealing a center that was still moist and yellow. "Top half's fine," he grunted. They sat at the small table, sharing the salvaged bread, picking the edible bits away from the charred edges. They were both ravenous. In her haste, Maris had gotten a smudge of black soot across her nose. Thorn looked at her, and the corner of his mouth twitched. He lifted a finger and pointed at his own chin, where a similar black streak resided. Maris looked at him, at this serious, silent man with a smudge of soot on his face, and a sound she hadn't made in months bubbled up in her chest. It was a laugh, a real, genuine, unforced laugh. He saw her laugh, and the twitch in his own mouth broke into a rare, quiet smile that lit his gray eyes from within. They sat there for a moment, two strangers in a borrowed life, laughing in the firelight over a burnt loaf of bread. A quiet peace settled over the cabin after that, as gentle and as gradual as dust accumulating on the strings of the banjo that hung, unplayed, on the wall. It was a silence that was no longer empty, but full of shared work, unspoken understanding, and the knowledge that, for the first time in her life, Maris was not alone. The storm did not arrive, it attacked. It had been looming for 2 days, a bruised, yellowish-purple bank of cloud squatting on the northern peaks, choking the light from the sky. Thorn had watched it, his face grim, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon as if in a standoff with an old adversary. They had spent the day securing the ranch, checking the reinforcing shutters on the cabin, double-looping the ropes on the hayricks, and moving the main herd into the deep, protected draw on the lee side of the mesa. The final task was the mare and her new foal, born only a week prior, too fragile to be left in the main barn. They were housed in a smaller, older stable, built by Thorn's father, its walls thick-cut spruce, chinked with moss and mud, almost as solid as the cabin itself. They had just finished laying fresh, deep straw and checking the mare's water when the first wall of the blizzard hit. It was not a gradual snowfall. It was an explosion of white, a deafening, suffocating roar of wind and ice that erased the world. The sound was overwhelming, a high-pitched scream that seemed to come from inside their own skulls. In an instant, the cabin, only 50 yards away, was gone, swallowed by the maelstrom. "We wait here," Thorn yelled over the din, his voice barely audible. He didn't even try to fight the door closed. He pointed to the small, windowless tack room at the back of the stable. It was a tiny space, smelling of hoof oil, worn leather, and dried herbs. In one corner sat a small, pot-bellied charcoal stove, its cast-iron body dark and cold. Thorn quickly unlatched a small box, taking out kindling and a handful of charcoal briquettes. In minutes, with the practiced, economical movements she had come to know, he had a fire going. The wind was a physical force, rattling the stable's heavy door in its frame, but the thick walls held. The small stove began to radiate a profound, penetrating warmth, and its small, grated door glowed a steady, deep cherry red, a single, watchful eye against the white fury outside. They sat on a low bench, their shoulders pressed together not by choice, but by the smallness of the room. The air was thick with the scent of the horses just outside the tack room door, their warm, grassy breath, the mineral smell of their sweat, the sweet, dry scent of the timothy hay. It was a pocket of life, an arc of warmth adrift in a sea of frozen chaos. For an hour, they sat in silence, listening. The storm was not a noise, it was the absence of all other sound, a constant, high-volume pressure that seemed to be trying to flatten the very building around them. Then, a gust of unimaginable force struck the stable's roof. There was a sound of immense pressure, a groan of timber, and then a loud, sharp crack as a heavy roof beam somewhere above them settled under the load, the wood fibers tearing. It was just a sound of a strong house holding fast, but to Maris, it was a trigger. She didn't make a sound, but Thorn, attuned to the slightest shift in the atmosphere, felt her change. He felt the muscles in her arm, shoulder, and back go rigid, as if she had been touched by lightning. She went utterly still, her breath, which had been a quiet, steady rhythm beside him, hitched and stopped. "Maris," he said, his voice low. She didn't answer. She was staring at the red eye of the stove, but she was seeing something else. The dim light, the smell of heat, the sound of splitting wood, it had all converged. She was back in Tin Lantern, choking on oily smoke, the roar of the fire in her ears, watching the main beam of the storehouse glow, sag, and then explode in a shower of sparks. She felt the dizziness, the sense that the floor was tilting beneath her, that the air was too thick to breathe. Maris. This time, his voice was sharper, cutting through the memory. She gasped, a raw, desperate intake of air. "The sound," she whispered, her voice trembling, unfamiliar. "The wood, when it snapped." He waited. He knew this was a threshold, a door opening into a room he had not been invited into. "The fire," she forced the words out, the confession tearing at her. "At the saloon, the storehouse. It sounded just like that, before it all came down." She turned to him, her eyes wide and dark, pupils swallowing the iris, reflecting the stove's red light. When I hear wood pop in the hearth, even in the cabin, I feel it. I can't breathe. I see the smoke. I think I'm still there." It was the most she had ever revealed of herself, of the terror that lived just beneath her skin. She was ashamed, angry at her own weakness, at the way her body had betrayed her. Thorn did not reply with a soft word. He did not say, "You're safe," or "It's all right." Those were just words, and the wind outside was proving how meaningless words could be. Instead, he moved. He shifted on the bench, turning to face her. Slowly, as if approaching one of his half-wild horses, he lifted his hand. It was a large hand, rough with calluses, the knuckles scarred, the nails blunt. He laid it flat against her chest, over the thick wool of her dress, directly on her sternum, where the panic was a cold, tight knot. His palm was impasse over his shirt and her dress. She could feel the impossible warmth of his skin. "Breathe with me," he said. It was not a request. It was an instruction. Not the wind, not the fire. Me. He held her gaze. "In," he commanded softly, and he took a slow, deep breath, his chest rising beneath his coat. She tried, but her breath was a ragged, shallow gasp. "Again," he said, his hand remaining steady, a warm, heavy weight on her center. "In, now out." He set the rhythm, as steady and as patient as he was with a green-broke colt. Inhale, a slow expansion of his lungs. Exhale, a controlled release. She watched his face, his eyes fixed on hers, and she listened to the sound of his breath, a low, quiet current beneath the shriek of the storm. Her own breathing was a frantic, broken thing, fighting his, but his hand was there, a physical anchor, a point of heat and pressure. "Listen to me. Breathe with me." Slowly, painfully, her body began to obey. Her ragged gasps began to lengthen. She began to match his rhythm. Inhale. The air smells like leather. Exhale. The cold knot is loosening. Inhale. His hand is so warm. Exhale. The wind is just wind. They sat like that for a full minute, their shared breath the only sound in the tiny room, a private, deliberate rhythm against the public chaos of the storm. The panic did not vanish, but it receded. It moved from her throat and her chest, beaten back by the sheer, stubborn, living presence of the man beside her. The dizziness passed. The scent of phantom smoke was replaced by the real, complex scents of the stable, the dry sweetness of the hay, the sharp ammonia tang from the stalls, the earthy warmth of the animals themselves, and closer, the scent of thorn of damp wool, old leather, and the clean, alkaline smell of the lye soap he used. It was the scent of her new life. It was the scent of safety. With a final, shuddering sigh, the last of the tension drained out of her. Her body went limp with the exhaustion of the fight, without conscious thought, driven by a simple, animal need for comfort and solidity. Maris let her head rest on his shoulder. It was a hard pillow. His coat was damp and rough against her cheek. Beneath it, his shoulder was unyielding, a ridge of muscle and bone. But it was there. It was solid. It was, she thought, like one of the old pines on the mesa, hard, weathered, and strong enough to withstand any storm. He didn't tense or pull away. He simply accepted her weight, a silent, living buttress. They sat in this new, deeper silence. The storm still raged, but it was outside, and they were in. The red eye of the stove glowed, Maris safe in this small, warm space. Let her eyes trace his profile in the dim light. The straight line of his nose, the firm set of his mouth, the dark stubble that shadowed his jaw. She saw it then, a faint, pale line that ran from the corner of his jaw up toward his ear, disappearing into his hairline. An old scar, white and smooth against the weathered skin. She had never been this close to him. She had never been this close to any man, not in this quiet, unguarded way. A flicker of curiosity, a fragile emotion she hadn't felt in a long time, rose in her. Her hand, which had been resting limply in her lap, lifted. It trembled, not with fear, but with hesitation. She raised it to his face, her fingers stopping an inch from his skin. He felt the motion, the change in the air between them. He stopped breathing. He did not turn his head, did not pull away, but he became utterly, completely still. He had given her his breath, given her his strength, and now he gave her his stillness. His eyes, dark in the shadows, slowly moved to meet hers. He did not speak, but the question was as clear as if he had shouted it. "Are you sure?" In answer, Maris gave a small, definite nod. She completed the gesture. Her fingertips, calloused from work but gentle, brushed against his cheek. She felt the roughness of his beard, and then the strange, smooth, different texture of the scar. It was a simple, exploratory touch, a mapping of this man who was her husband. He closed his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability she had never seen. He read her touch as the permission it was. He turned his head, a slow, deliberate motion. He leaned in, giving her every second, every fraction of an inch, to turn away. She did not. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of fire or force. It was as light and as cool as the snow ash the outline had described, a touch as gentle as the first snowflake of the season landing on her skin. It was hesitant, dry, and full of a quiet, profound respect. It was a question, a discovery, and a promise, all in one. She did not pull back. She felt the warmth of his breath, the simple, solid presence of his mouth against hers. And she leaned in. It was a fractional movement, a tiny shift of weight, but it was her answer. It was her leading. Only then did he let the kiss settle. His mouth softened against hers, a silent communication of presence. "I am here." His hand, the one that had been on her chest, moved, finding her hand in her lap, Their fingers, cold-tipped and awkward, interlaced, his grip slowly tightening, a solid, warm link. His other arm came around her, pulling her closer, drawing her coat and his own tight around them both, a shared cocoon against the cold. She tilted her head, and the skin of her neck, just below her ear, brushed against the rough wool collar of his coat. She could feel the heat of his skin beneath it, a living, steady warmth that seemed to flow directly into her. The kiss did not deepen, did not demand. It simply was, a long, quiet moment of shared warmth and discovery. Then, as gently as it had begun, it ended. He pulled back, but only an inch. His eyes, when they opened, were dark and serious. He did not smile. They settled back, not as they were before, but differently. He kept his arm around her. Their hands remained clasped. They leaned against the rough plank wall of the tack room, their legs stretched toward the stove's red glow. They were side by side, wrapped in coats and the shared, quiet intimacy of the moment. They had not crossed any lines. They had simply, carefully, drawn a new one, a circle that included them both. The wind howled, a lost, lonely sound. But inside the stable, in their small, warm room, there was no sound but the hiss of the stove and the heavy, slow thud of two hearts, beating in a new, shared rhythm, a gentle, unspoken commitment. Maris looked at his profile, at the solid line of his jaw, the shadow of the scar, the strength that had become her sanctuary. She opened her mouth, and her own name for him, the one she had only ever thought in fear or in formality, came out. It was not a plea. It was not a question. It was a statement. It was the first time she had said it without a trace of a tremble. Thorn. The quiet intimacy born in the storm-bound stable was a fragile thing, a seedling taking root in the frozen ground of their arrangement. It lived in the small spaces between their words, in the way his eyes would find hers across the cabin, in the slight hesitation before she handed him his morning coffee. The peace, however, was not destined to last. It was a shelter built in the path of an avalanche. The avalanche arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a man on a tall, black horse. He was not from Copper Vale. His star was a polished silver that caught the weak winter sun, different from the dull, tarnished tin of Marshal Baird's men. He introduced himself as Deputy Crane Yarrow, from the county seat at Boone Hollow. He was a lean, wiry man who moved with a disconcerting fluidity. As if he had no sharp angles, his smile was the thinnest thing Maris had ever seen, a pale, bloodless line that did not touch his eyes. His eyes were the color of stagnant water, watchful and cold. He had come, he said, to review the file on the tin lantern fire. Just a formality, he explained, his smile widening by a fraction, making it look sharper, like a crack in thin ice. County likes to keep its ledgers tidy. He sat at their small table, the official-looking papers spread before him, while Maris stood by the hearth, her hands tightly gripping her plum-colored apron. Thorne stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence a silent, solid wall. Yarrow read through the documents, his finger tracing a line of text, his head cocked as if listening to a silent storyteller. "Says here," Yarrow began, not looking up, "that a witness saw a woman matching your description, Mrs. Ellison, leaving the scene, a woman carrying a satchel." He finally lifted his eyes and fixed them on her. "Marshal Baird seems to think you might have something to add to his report, something you've been reluctant to share." "My wife has told the marshal what she knows." Thorne's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Which is nothing." Yarrow's smile tightened again. "Is that so? Well, the law has a long memory, and long arms. A formal warrant for questioning can reach all the way out here to Cinder Valley. It would be a shame to have to drag Mrs. Ellison all the way to Boone Hollow for a simple conversation, especially with the snow getting deeper." He gathered his papers with a series of quick, precise movements. "You have a good day." "Ellison, ma'am." He tipped his hat, the gesture an insult in its mock courtesy, and was gone. The threat hung in the air long after he had ridden away, as thick and as suffocating as the smoke she remembered from that night. The deputy's visit was a catalyst. It shattered the quiet peace and replaced it with a cold, urgent dread. That night, Maris did not sleep. She sat by the fire, the oil lamp turned low, and for the first time in weeks, she took out the saloon ledger. The book was more than just a piece of evidence. It was the source of all her trouble, the physical manifestation of the lie that had entangled her life. She paged through it again, her eyes scanning the familiar columns of figures, the spidery scrawl of Jebediah Finch, and the spiky, alien pencil marks next to the shipments of cattle and blasting powder. The symbol, the small triangle with a line through it, seemed to mock her. It was a key to a lock she couldn't find. Thorne had been out late, checking on the mare in foal. When he returned, he found her hunched over the book, her face pale in the lamplight. He didn't ask what she was doing. He simply pulled up the other chair and sat, watching the fire. After a long silence, he spoke. "I was at the freight office today," he said, his voice quiet. "Picking up a new harness. Saw a stack of invoices on the counter. From the Railroad Survey Company." Maris looked up, her heart giving a sudden, hard thump. "They were for iron spikes, delivered to the survey camps up north," he continued, his gaze still on the flames. "Signed for by the regional inspector." He paused. "A man named Silas Bray." "Did you see the invoices?" Maris asked, her voice a whisper. "Just the top one," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't the invoice itself, but a piece of scrap paper from the freight office counter. "I asked the clerk for a receipt, made him write it on the back of this." He unfolded it. It was a discarded freight manifest, detailing a shipment of tools. But on the bottom was the clerk's hurried scrawl, and beneath that, faint but clear where the pen had pressed through from the document below it, was an impression, an indentation in the paper. It was the signature of the man who had authorized the shipment, Silas Bray, and next to his name, pressed into the paper as a final, official flourish, was a small, triangular stamp with a single, horizontal line through its center. Maris stared, her breath catching in her throat. She quickly flipped through the saloon ledger to one of the marked pages. She held the scrap of paper next to the faint pencil marking. They were identical. The symbol was not just a random doodle. It was a sign-off. Bray's mark. The same man who was forging land deeds for the railroad was also signing off on phantom cattle shipments and massive quantities of blasting powder being funneled through a backwater saloon. The pieces were connecting, forming a dark, ugly picture. But it was a picture with a large, missing section. Where was the blasting powder now? The answer, or at least a clue, came a few days later from an old trapper Thorne sometimes did business with. The man had stopped by the ranch to trade a string of beaver pelts for a sack of flour and some coffee. As they stood by the corral, the trapper, a garrulous man named Jed, mentioned that he'd seen strange goings-on up near Creekside Narrows. "Two fellas," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Diggin', middle of the night, on that little spit of the land just past the old hawthorn grove. Figured they was prospectors looking for a winter claim. But they was mighty secretive about it. Heard my horse and they doused their lantern quicker than a snake vanishes in the grass." Creekside Narrows, the name the old mail rider had mumbled, the name of the place where he'd said the devil's pantry was hidden. That night, under the thin, cold light of a crescent moon, Thorne and Maris rode out, not on the main trail, but through the deep, silent woods that bordered the valley. They tethered the horses in a thick stand of pine and made their way on foot to the ridge overlooking the Narrows. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. The creek below was a ribbon of black ice, silent and still. They waited. The hours crawled by. the cold seeping deep into their bones. Just as Maris was beginning to think the trapper had been mistaken, she saw it, a faint, bobbing light, far down the creek bed, a shielded lantern. Two figures, bundled in heavy coats, emerged from the shadows. They carried shovels. They moved to the spit of land Jed had described and began to dig, the sound of their shovels striking the frozen, rocky earth a dull, muffled thud that carried on the still night air. They worked for nearly an hour, then seemed to find what they were looking for. They lifted a heavy, wooden crate from the hole, refilled the earth, and then disappeared back into the darkness from which they had come. Thorn and Maris waited another 30 minutes, their bodies stiff with cold and tension, before making their way down to the site. The ground was disturbed. The snow scuffed and trampled. There was nothing else to see. They were turning to leave when Thorn's eye caught something on the trunk of a gnarled, ancient hawthorn tree that stood sentinel over the spot. He walked over to it, Maris close behind. There, carved deep into the gray, weathered bark, were 3 short, parallel lines, cut with a sharp knife. The carving was fresh, the wood beneath still pale. "A transfer mark," Thorn said, his voice a low growl. "Used by rustlers. Means the goods have been moved. The site is clear." The symbol in the ledger, the blasting powder, the digging in the night, the transfer mark. It was a conspiracy, a hidden war being waged for the land in this valley, and Maris was trapped in the middle of it. The final piece of the trap was sprung a week later at the Saturday market in Copper Vale. They were at the mercantile, Maris examining bolts of wool, when a voice, smooth and cultured, spoke from behind her. "Mrs. Ellison, is it not a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance?" Maris turned. The man was handsome, dressed in a fine city coat and a bowler hat. His smile was pleasant, his eyes a warm, friendly brown. But there was a reptilian stillness about him, a predatory calm that made the hair on her arm stand on end. "I am Silas Bray," he said, tipping his hat. "I handle certain land acquisitions for the railroad. I've had the pleasure of doing some business with your husband." Thorn, who had been speaking to the blacksmith across the room, turned and walked over, his face an unreadable mask. "Bray," he said, his voice a flat acknowledgement. "Ellison," Bray beamed, his smile unwavering. "I was just congratulating you. Your wife is a credit to you. And I must say," he added, his gaze flicking down to Maris's feet, "your handiwork is most impressive. A man of many talents, rancher, husband, and a fine cobbler. It would seem it's not every man who would take the time to resole his wife's boots with such care." The air went still. The friendly chatter of the mercantile seemed to fade into a dull roar in Maris's ears. Her boots, a detail no one could know. A detail no one could have seen unless they had been watching the cabin, unless they had been spying. It was not a compliment. It was a threat. It was Bray telling them, in the most pleasant, civilized way possible, that he saw everything, that her sanctuary was not a fortress, but a fishbowl. Thorn's eyes, when they met Maris's, were as cold and as hard as river ice. He didn't react, didn't rise to the bait. He simply placed a hand on Maris's elbow. "Our business here is concluded," he said to Bray, his voice level. "Good day." They walked out of the store, the weight of Bray's words pressing down on them. They were halfway to the wagon when a voice called out, "Maris Ellison." It was Deputy Crane Yarrow. He was not alone. 2 of Marshal Baird's local men stood behind him, their expressions grim. Yarrow held a piece of paper in his hand. "By the authority of the Boone County Judiciary," he announced, his voice carrying across the street, "you are under arrest." "On what charge?" Thorn's voice was dangerously quiet. He moved to stand slightly in front of Maris, a shield of flesh and bone. Yarrow's thin smile appeared. "Obstructing an official investigation. It seems you've been less than forthcoming about your activities in Tin Lantern, and we have reason to believe you have been consorting with known fugitives. It was a lie, a fabrication, a charge so vague it could mean anything, and was therefore impossible to disprove. It was a net, woven of legal jargon, and it was closing around her. Thorn did not move. He did not reach for the pistol holstered at his hip. He did not curse or threaten. He became utterly, terrifyingly calm. "Show me the warrant," he said. Yarrow handed it to him. Thorn read it, his eyes missing nothing. The signature was valid. The charge was legal. It was a legitimate, state-sanctioned kidnapping. "You have the right to a lawyer," Thorn said, his eyes locking with Yarrow's. "I'll be sending for the district attorney from Red Willow. You will hold her here, in Copper Vale, until he arrives." "My orders," Yarrow said smoothly, "are to escort the prisoner to the county facility in Boone Hollow for questioning. And my wife has the right to visitation." Thorn continued, his voice like iron. "I'll be exercising that right daily." He was not fighting them with force. He was fighting them with the law, using their own weapon against them, building a wall of procedure around Maris that they would have to break through. "Take her," Yarrow said to his men, his smile finally faltering in the face of Thorn's cold, unyielding calm. As the two men stepped forward, their hands reaching for her, a figure bustled through the crowd. It was Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife. "Child, you forgot this," she said, her voice loud and flustered. She pressed a small, heavy object into Maris's hand, a wrapped parcel of what felt like iron nails she had just purchased. "For the fence mending," she said, her eyes meeting Maris's for a fraction of a second, conveying a world of meaning. A good wife always finishes her chores. As the men led Maris toward a waiting prisoner wagon, she felt the parcel in her hand. It was not just nails. Wrapped inside the thick paper, she could feel the cold, distinct and unmistakable shape of a ring of old iron keys, and she heard Mrs. Gable's final words, whispered so only she could hear as she was pushed past. "An old debt, long since paid." Thorn stood, unmoving, as they loaded her into the back of the wagon and barred the door. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, had turned a leaden gray. As the wagon began to pull out of town, the first fat flakes of snow began to fall. Within minutes, it was a blinding, swirling curtain of white, a sudden, furious squall that swallowed the world. The snow fell faster and faster, a thick, heavy blanket. It covered the muddy street, it covered the rooftops, and it covered the tracks of the prisoner wagon as it turned not west, toward the main road to Boone Hollow, but south, onto a smaller, less traveled path that led into the deep, snow-choked wilderness. The snow was a living entity, a blind, white beast that devoured the world. It fell not in flakes, but in horizontal, stinging sheets, driven by a wind that howled with the voice of a banshee. Thorn Ellison kept his horse, a tough-bitted roan mare that knew this territory as well as he did, to a steady walk, his head bent low, the brim of his hat pulled down to shield his eyes. He was a ghost in the blizzard, a shadow tracking other shadows. He had the visitation warrant in his breast pocket, a single, flimsy piece of paper that was his only legal weapon. But his true advantage was the storm itself. It forced the prisoner wagon to move slowly, and it kept the guards huddled deep in their coats, their attention turned inward against the cold. He rode parallel to the main track, using the sparse stands of pine and the rolling contours of the land for cover, a skill he'd learned not as a lawman, but as a rancher who had tracked lost stock and hunted predators. As he'd suspected, they weren't taking the main stage road to Boone Hollow. The route was too public, too slow in this weather. The wagon driver, a man Thorn didn't recognize, was following the old, disused mineral track that cut south through the foothills. It was a harder road, but a more private one. They were 5 miles from Boone Hollow. in a desolate, wind-swept basin known as Crow's Trough. When Thorne saw the second vehicle, it was a light, enclosed buggy, pulled by a single, powerful-looking black horse, waiting in the meager shelter of a rock outcropping. The prisoner wagon pulled to a halt beside it. Thorne dismounted, his movements economical, and bellied down behind a snow-covered ridge, the roan standing silent as a stone behind him. He saw Crane Yarrow emerge from the buggy. The deputy was impatient, his thin form vibrating with a nervous energy. He exchanged sharp words with the guards. Money changed hands. Then the back of the wagon was unbarred, and Maris was hustled out. She was not in chains. He noted a small, cold comfort. She stumbled in the deep snow, her hands bound in front of her. Yarrow grabbed her arm, his grip rough, and pushed her into the buggy, climbing in after her. The prisoner wagon turned, its wheels groaning, and began the long, slow trek back to Copper Vale. Yarrow, in his faster buggy, cracked a whip and disappeared into the swirling white, heading toward Boone Hollow. Thorne did not follow immediately. He waited, letting the distance grow. He knew where Yarrow was going, not to the official county courthouse and its adjoining stone jail. He was going to the old land office, a rickety, two-story wooden building on the edge of town that had been bought. Thorne knew, by a holding company represented by Silas Bray. It was a private jail for a private war. He circled the town, stashing the roan in a deep, hidden draw he'd known since he was a boy, and came into Boone Hollow on foot, a phantom moving through the blizzard-emptied streets. Maris was freezing, but her mind was sharp, honed by a terror that was colder than the snow. The room they had locked her in was not a cell. It was worse. It was a records room, its walls lined with shelves of dusty, leather-bound ledgers. It smelled of decaying paper, mice, and the faint, bitter scent of ink. A single oil lamp on a small, cluttered desk cast a pool of sickly yellow light, leaving the corners of the room in deep, oppressive shadow. There was a cot against one wall, a thin, lumpy mattress on a bare iron frame. This was the trap. Not iron bars, but psychological pressure. A cell was a place of confinement. This was a place of business. They didn't want to jail her. They wanted her to negotiate. They wanted her to sign the confession Yarrow had placed on the desk, a neatly penned document attesting to her full and willing admission of arson in Tin Lantern, in exchange for a suspended sentence and immediate release. The man left to guard her was not a deputy. He was a clerk, a weedy man with a green eyeshade and ink stains on his fingers. Named Amos, he sat at the desk, pointedly ignoring her, scratching away at a ledger with a steel-nibbed pen. The sound was a constant, irritating scrape. Scrape, scrape. Maris walked the small room, her mind racing. She felt the heavy, paper-wrapped parcel from Mrs. Gable still in her coat pocket. She had not had a moment to examine it. She sat on the cot, the springs groaning in protest, and forced her body to be still, to watch, to listen. Amos was a complainer, he muttered to himself as he wrote, cursing the cold, the late hour, and his pay. Not enough, he'd whisper, his pen digging into the paper. Not nearly enough for this kind of extracurricular work. Maris saw her opening. She cleared her throat. Amos looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten she was there. It must be a great deal of trouble, Maris said, her voice soft, sympathetic. Guarding a dangerous prisoner like me. Amos sneered. You're not dangerous. You're just paperwork. Complicated paperwork. Still, Maris pressed. The reward must be significant. I heard in Copper Vale that the railroad was paying a substantial bonus for my cooperation. Amos's eyes narrowed, a flicker of greed in their watery depths. Not as substantial as you'd think, not for the likes of me. Anyway, it's men like Yarrow who get the real bonus. He's been bragging for a week about the premium he's getting from Bray as soon as your signature is on that paper. He nodded at the confession on his desk. Calls it his retirement fund. It was there. The confirmation. Yarrow wasn't just a corrupt lawman. He was a hired hand, paid directly by Bray to secure her conviction. Her testimony, if she ever gave it, was now worthless. It was one word against a paid-off deputy. Only the ledger in Thorne's possession, if he still had it, could save her now. Outside, the storm's fury seemed to intensify. Suddenly, a great crash echoed from the front of the building, followed by a man's furious, drunken shouting. "You ruined my wagon, my axle. You'll pay for this, you hear me?" Amos shot to his feet, knocking his chair over. "Damnation, what now?" More shouting erupted, this time from Yarrow in the outer office. Amos grabbed his lamp, his face pale with annoyance. "Stay put," he hissed at Maris, as if she had anywhere to go. He ran from the room, pulling the heavy door shut. The lock, an old, heavy mortise lock, clicked loudly into place. Maris was alone in the dark. In the alley behind the land office, Thorne threw the heavy wagon spar he'd accidentally jammed into the wheel of a parked freight wagon into a snowdrift. He'd found Mr. Gable, the blacksmith, already in town and given him the signal. The diversion. A loud, profane argument between Gable and a stranger, one of Thorne's own ranch hands, was in full swing, drawing every man in the building to the front windows. Thorne moved to the back of the building, to a heavy, snow-caked door. He pulled the parcel from his pocket. The paper was damp, but the objects inside were solid. He unwrapped them. It was not a full ring of keys. It was a small, leather-wrapped set of iron picks and tension wrenches. Mrs. Gable's old debt was not to Bray, but from him. Her husband, the blacksmith, had installed every lock in this building years ago, and had apparently kept a professional-grade set of duplicates. He slid the tension wrench into the keyhole of the warehouse door. His hands, though cold, were steady. He had mended complex harness rigging and delicate clockwork mechanisms. A simple lock was just another machine. He applied pressure, inserted a rake, and in less than 10 seconds, felt the pins align. A dull, metallic thunk echoed in the alley. He slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The darkness was absolute, thick and cold. It smelled of sulfur, damp earth, and oil. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light blinding, and lit the oil lamp he'd brought in his saddlebag. He was in Silas Bray's arsenal. The crates were stacked to the ceiling. Danger, blasting powder, casks of it. Beside them were coils of thick, tarred fuse, and on a workbench, laid out as if for a project, were postal receipts, all from the freight office in Tin Lantern, all dated the day before the fire. They were for mining equipment, shipped to a non-existent company at Bray's address in Boone Hollow. He found the prize in a locked iron box under the workbench. He didn't need the picks. The key, clearly marked, was hanging on a nail right above it. Yarrow's arrogance. The box was not for security, it was for convenience. Inside, beneath a stack of forged land deeds and grazing permits, was the book. It was thin, bound in black oilcloth to protect it from the weather. Thorne opened it. The lamplight fell on the neat, spiky, familiar handwriting, the same hand that had marked the saloon ledger. But this was not a book of accounts. It was a plan. It was a diary of a corporate war. Each page was a new phase. Page 2, Displacement of Homesteaders via Permit Challenges, C. SBV Abernathy. Page 4, Destruction of TL Saloon Ledger, C. HB Arson Est. Cost 1 witness bonus. 1 storehouse. Page 7, Final Land Acquisition. Creekside parcels. It was all there. The accidents. The old mail rider. The fire. Maris. It was a cold, brutal catalog of Bray's conquest, and Yarrow was named as his instrument. Thorne slipped the oilcloth ledger inside his coat, against his chest. It felt warm. A small, dark heart of pure malice. He doused his lamp, his hand steady. He had the proof. Now he had to get his wife. He eased the warehouse door open. The wind had died down, the snow falling in a thick, heavy, muffling curtain. The shouting from the front of the building had subsided. He stepped into the alley, his eyes adjusting to the deep, gray gloom. Dropping something off, Ellison. Crane Yarrow stood 10 feet away, a long-barreled revolver in his hand. Aimed not at Thorne's head, but at his center mass. The diversion had been too short, or Yarrow was too smart. "I have a warrant for my wife's visitation," Thorne said, his voice level, his hands held open and away from his body. "Your warrant's void," Yarrow sneered, the thin smile back in place. He looked exhilarated, his eyes bright in the gloom. "So is your little arrangement. Bray wants the girl, and he wants the ledger she stole. I figure you have it. Hand it over, then you can just disappear. A rancher, lost in the blizzard. A tragedy." He thumbed back the hammer of his pistol. The sound, a dry, double click, was deafening in the silence. Thorne did not look at the gun. He looked at Yarrow's eyes. He saw the overconfidence, the anticipation. Yarrow was a man who liked to talk, who liked to savor his small, cruel victories. "She didn't have the ledger," Thorne said. Yarrow's smile faltered. "What?" "I did," Thorne said. He took one long, deliberate step forward. Yarrow's finger tightened on the trigger. "Stop, don't move." Thorne took a second step, faster than the first. Yarrow, surprised by the blatant, suicidal defiance, flinched. His gun wavered for a fraction of a second. It was all Thorne needed. He didn't reach for his own pistol. He lunged. In 3 pounding strides, he closed the distance. Yarrow, panicking, tried to level the gun and fire, but Thorne was not aiming for the gun. He was inside Yarrow's guard, his left hand grabbing the deputy's wrist, twisting it inward, pointing the revolver at the snow-covered ground. Yarrow's fingers spasmed. The gun exploded, a deafening roar and a flash of orange that lit the alley. The bullet buried itself harmlessly in the earth. Before Yarrow could pull the trigger a second time, Thorne's right fist, a solid, knotted block of ranch-honed muscle, traveling only 6 inches, connected with the deputy's jaw. It was not a flashy punch. It was a functional, practical, brutal impact of bone on bone. Yarrow's head snapped back. A small, choked gasp escaped his lips, and he collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, unconscious before he hit the snow. Thorne did not check on him. He ripped the ring of keys from Yarrow's belt, retrieved the smoking revolver from the snow, and ran for the office door. He found Amos the clerk cowering under his desk. Thorne grabbed him by the shirt front and hauled him to his feet. "The records room! Open it, now!" Amos, his face as white as the snow outside, fumbled with his own key, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't find the lock. Thorne threw him aside, found the right key on Yarrow's ring, and thrust it into the lock. The door swung open. Maris stood there, her face a pale oval in the darkness. She wasn't cowering. She was holding the heavy iron leg she had managed to break off the cot, holding it like a club. He didn't have time for relief. "Come on," he grabbed her hand. "We ride now." They ran, back through the alley, over the unconscious form of Crane Yarrow. Thorne stopped only long enough to use a length of horse rope from his saddlebag. He didn't kill. He didn't need to. He bound Yarrow's hands and feet, tightly and expertly, and left him in the alley. He kicked the lamp out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. He would freeze, but he would not perish before he was found. They reached the roan in the draw. The mare, loyal and steady, hadn't moved. Thorne threw Maris into the saddle, then swung up behind her, his body a solid shield around hers. "Hold on," he ordered. He turned the horse not toward the road, but straight up the mountainside, toward the high pass. It was the only way. The direct route to the district court at Red Willow. They rode through the driving snow, the blizzard their ally once more, covering their tracks, swallowing them whole. They crested the high pass at Coyote Switch just as the first false gray light of dawn began to poison the eastern sky. The snow had lessened, the wind a low moan, and from the rocks above them, a single rifle shot cracked through the frozen air. There was no time to think, only to react. Thorn roared down and threw his own body to the left, covering Maris, trying to shield her with his own bulk, pulling them both from the saddle. He felt a white-hot, searing pain, like a branding iron, slam into his left shoulder. It tore through his coat, a fiery punch that spun him around. They hit the snowdrift together, a tangle of limbs. As a second shot pinged off the rock they had just vacated, the impact of the bullet was a brutal, physical shock, a massive, tearing force that ripped the world sideways. Thorn grunted, a deep, primal sound of pain, and his weight, combined with the momentum of the fall, dragged them both from the roan's back. They landed in a deep, forgiving snowdrift, a tangle of limbs, the air exploding from their lungs. Above them, the second shot screamed off the rock, spitting stone fragments and lead. The assassin was reloading. His position high, his advantage absolute. "Go!" Thorn gasped. His voice a strained, broken thing she had never heard. He tried to push her, his face a mask of white-hot agony, his left arm hanging uselessly. "The horse! Run!" "No," Maris said, the word a flat, iron rejection. She grabbed the collar of his coat, the one he had MCT cut for her, and pulled. Get up, Thorn." He was a dead weight. The snow around his shoulder was already turning a dark, sickening crimson. She looked around, frantic. The pass was a death trap, but 50 yards down the slope, half buried in a drift, was a shape, a roof line, a single, derelict chimney. "The old post station," he breathed, recognizing it. "Cinder post." "Can you walk?" "No." "Then I'll drag you." She was not a large woman, but she was strong, her strength born of hauling sacks of flour and kegs of beer. She got her shoulder under his good arm, took his weight, and heaved. Thorn roared in pain as his injured side was jostled, but he used his legs, pushing, driving them forward. They moved in a desperate, lurching stagger. 2 steps, then a fall, then 2 more. Each step was an eternity. The snow was a clinging, malicious enemy. She heard the crack of the third shot, but it was wide, the shooter likely confused by their sudden move into the dead ground of the gully. They fell against the door of the abandoned mail relay station. It was frozen shut. Thorn, his face slick with sweat despite the freezing air, kicked at it with his boot. The rotten wood splintered. Maris threw her shoulder against it, and they tumbled inside, falling onto a floor covered in dust, ice, and old, mummified leaves. Maris scrambled back, slamming the ruined door shut and dropping the heavy iron bar that still hung on its brackets. They were safe. For now. The single room was a tomb of cold. It smelled of decay, rat droppings, and the acidic scent of old, cold ash. A broken table lay on its side. A rusted, pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, its pipe jagged and broken. But in the far wall, there was a massive, stone fireplace, black with the soot of 1,000 old fires. "The pack," Thorn rasped, slumping against the wall. His eyes clenched shut. "On the roan." She ran. "No, trained her. She'll be in the lee." He was fading, his voice thinning. Maris peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. The roan mare, true to his word, was standing 20 yards away in the shelter of a thick pine grove, her head down, waiting. The assassin was nowhere to be seen, likely waiting them out, believing them trapped. "Stay here," she ordered. Maris, don't. She was already out the door, moving low and fast, using the building as a shield. She ran, her lungs burning, expecting the crack of the rifle at any second. She reached the horse, her hands fumbling with the frozen leather straps of the saddlebags. She grabbed the bedroll, the small sack of coffee and hardtack, and his rifle, the Winchester, from its scabbard. She untied the lariat, slung it all over her shoulder, and ran back, the horse following her part way before its nerve broke and it trotted back to the trees. She bolted the door, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. Thorn was paler, his breathing shallow. The dark stain on his coat was spreading. "First," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "Fire, then you." She worked with a frantic, focused energy. The broken table was dry kindling. She hacked at it with Thorn's belt knife, which she pulled from his sheath. She laid a fire in the hearth, her hands raw and clumsy with cold. She found his matchbox in the saddlebag. It was watertight. The kindling caught, a small, desperate flame. She piled on the larger pieces of the table, and the old, dry wood roared to life. A sudden, glorious explosion of heat and light in the dark, cold room. Only then did she turn to him. He was shivering, his teeth chattering, though sweat was pouring down his face. "The water," she said, grabbing the tin pot from the pack. She scooped it full of clean, deep snow from a drift that had blown in through a hole in the roof, and set it on the stones by the fire to boil. "We have to see it." "It's fine," he muttered, his pride a stubborn, failing reflex. "No, it's not." She was no longer asking. She was in charge. His life depended on her, and they both knew it. She took the knife. "I'm going to cut the coat." He just nodded, his jaw tight. The sheepskin coat, his armor against the world, was thick. She had to saw at it, the blade slipping on the blood-matted wool. He let out a low, involuntary hiss of pain as she pulled the heavy, ruined garment away from his shoulder. His shirt beneath was a solid mass of dark, coagulated blood. "This too," she said, and slit the flannel from his collar to his waist. She winced. The bullet had not struck bone. It had passed through, high on the shoulder, but it had torn a ragged, ugly channel through the thick muscle of his trapezius. It was a deep, weeping valley of torn flesh, dark and terrifying. The water was boiling. She pulled it from the heat and set it in the snow by the door to cool, her mind racing. This was not mending a boot. This was not kneading dough. "In the pack," he whispered, his eyes on the ceiling. "A small tin. Smells like pine." She found it, a trapper's salve, a thick, green-black paste of pine resin, beeswax, and herbs, an antiseptic. Beside it was a small flask of whiskey. "And in my sewing kit," she murmured to herself, retrieving her own small satchel. "The darning needles and the linen thread." Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from sheer, paralyzing terror. She looked at the wound, then at the small needle, and a wave of nausea rose in her. I can't do this." She looked at Thorn's face. He was watching her. He wasn't watching the wound. He wasn't watching her hands. He was watching her eyes. His gaze was level, filled with a raw, agonizing pain, but it was also filled with something else, a quiet, absolute, terrifying trust. He was not the strong, silent rancher. He was just a man, bleeding in a cold room, and he had placed his life, without question, into her trembling hands. That look was a cold splash of water. Her panic receded, replaced by a blade of pure, cold resolve. Her hands, just moments ago shaking uncontrollably, became steady. She poured half the flask of whiskey onto a strip of cloth torn from her own petticoat and, bracing herself, she began to clean the wound. Thorn did not cry out. He roared, a choked, guttural sound as the alcohol hit the raw nerves. His entire body arched off the floor, his good hand gripping his thighs so hard his knuckles turned white. He did not act the hero. He did not hide his agony. He endured it, his face contorted, his breath sawing in and out. Maris's face was pale, tears streaming from her eyes, but her hands were firm. She cleaned it meticulously, flushing the torn flesh of cloth fibers and dirt, her touch both gentle and brutal in its necessity. When she was done, he was limp, exhausted, covered in a cold sweat. She threaded the darning needle with a heavy linen thread. "I'll be as fast as I can," she whispered. He just nodded, his eyes closed. She took the first stitch. The needle was thick, clumsy. It resisted the skin. She had to force it, her stomach churning. His body flinched, a violent full-body tremor. "Talk," he gritted out, his eyes still squeezed shut. "Tell me, about the ranch. What needs fixing?" It was a brilliant, desperate plea for distraction. So she did. Her voice, thin and shaking at first, then gaining strength, filled the small, warm room. The window latch on the larder is loose. It rattles in the wind." She pulled the first stitch tight, the edges of the wound weeping. "And the wood pile is too low. You'll need to cut more pine before the next heavy snow." She took the second stitch. He was breathing in short, sharp gasps, matching her movements. He had opened his eyes. He was watching her face, not the needle. He was, she realized, memorizing her, searing this moment, this image of her, into his mind. He was watching the woman he trusted. "I think," she continued, her voice softening, her movements becoming more rhythmic. "I think Sage, the gray mare, has a stone bruise on her left forefoot. She's favoring it." Stitch after slow, agonizing stitch. She worked with the same methodical focus she used to mend his denim trousers. Her movements economical, her jaw set. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, tracking the flicker of the firelight in her eyes, the smear of soot on her cheek, the fierce, protective set of her mouth. When it was done, a ragged, ugly line of black thread closing the wound. They were both trembling, both soaked in sweat. She packed the wound with a thick, medicinal pine salve, the sharp, clean scent of it cutting through the metallic smell of blood. She bandaged it tightly with more strips of her petticoat. He lay back, his breathing ragged, the fever already beginning to radiate from his skin. The crisis was over. The long, slow battle for his life had begun. She made him drink the rest of the whiskey, and then brewed coffee, strong and black, forcing him to sip it. The storm howled, a living thing of rage outside their sanctuary. But inside, the fire was a roaring, steady heart. The small, abandoned room was filled with the scent of pine, leather, coffee, and the warm, close smell of two human bodies. She sat beside him, watching his breathing. The fever took hold as night fell. He began to shiver, his teeth chattering violently, though his skin was burning. She covered him with his own bedroll and her coat, but he still shivered. There was nothing else. She lay down beside him on the hard, dusty floor, pulling the heavy wool blanket over them both, her back pressed against his good side, her arm over his chest. She was a living furnace, lending him her warmth, her own pulse a steady, living counter-rhythm to the frantic, fevered beat of his. He quieted, his shivers subsiding, and fell into a shallow, restless sleep. She woke in the deep dark. Hours later, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, red-gold coals. The room was blessedly, intensely warm. Thorne was awake. His fever was high, his eyes overly bright in the dim light. But he was lucid. His head was turned, and he was watching her. The rough, matted stubble on his jaw was silvered in the firelight. He looked, for the first time, not just vulnerable, but unkempt. She had her small utility knife in her pocket. Without thinking, moved by an instinct deeper than thought, she pulled it out and clicked it open. He tensed, his eyes going to the blade. "Your beard," she whispered. "It's matted with snow." She hesitated, then found the words. It's a thing a wife would do, if she wanted to. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. He was placing his life in her hands again, in a different, but no less profound, way. He closed his eyes. It was his assent. She knelt beside him, her movements slow, infinitely careful. She used the hot water from the pot to dampen a cloth, softening the stubble. The knife was razor sharp. She held his head steady, her hand on his uninjured shoulder, and began to scrape. The sound a faint, rough shh in the quiet room. It was the most intimate thing she had ever done. Her hand was steady, her touch light, her focus absolute. When she finished, his jaw was smooth under her fingers. She wiped his face clean with the damp cloth. He opened his eyes. The fever was still there, but the pain had receded, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a raw, unguarded gratitude. The warmth in the room was no longer just from the fire. It was between them. It was a thick, palpable presence. He lifted his good hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing the smudge of soot on her cheek. His eyes asked the question. Maris leaned down, her gaze locked with his, and gave the smallest, most definite of nods. He kissed her, or perhaps she kissed him. It was impossible to tell. It began with the same gentle, searching pressure as the kiss in the stable, but it deepened, not with passion, but with a desperate, profound need for life, for connection, for an anchor in the storm. His good arm came around her, pulling her down, his hands sliding into her hair. Her hands framed his face, her touch a promise of safety, of presence. It was a kiss of shared survival, of a bond forged in blood and fear. When they broke apart, they were both breathless. The room was silent, save for the wind's low moan and the sound of their hearts, a fast, steady drumbeat. She lay back down beside him, pulling the blanket over them. He was warm, his skin radiating heat. They lay close, a necessary, shared warmth. There were no lines to cross. There was no boundary but the one of respect, the soft, unspoken border of his injury and their shared exhaustion. He was weak, and she was his guardian. It was as simple as that. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his body finally relaxing into the warmth. His head lolled on the saddlebag he was using as a pillow, his face turned toward hers in the dim, glowing dark. "Maris," he whispered, his voice rough. "I'm here. You knew what to do, back in the cabin, with the hinge, with the laundry, with the boots." He paused, gathering his strength. I don't need you to know how to be a wife. Not from a book, not from anyone." His eyes held hers, his gaze a burning, fever-bright promise. "Just stay with me." She couldn't speak. The words were too big, her throat too thick. Instead, she moved, pressing her forehead against his, her eyes closing. It was a vow, a silent, binding answer that was more powerful than any word she could have spoken. "I am here. I will stay." Outside, the wind howled its grief against the stone, but inside the small, ruined station, there was only the smell of pine resin, worn leather, and the steady, quiet rhythm of two hearts, finally beating as one. When the gray light of morning finally filtered through the cracks, the storm had passed. The world was silent, draped in a thick, new blanket of white. Maris woke first, stiff and cold. Thorn was asleep, his fever broken. His skin was cool, his breathing deep and even. She built up the fire, made coffee, and checked his bandage. The wound was clean, the stitches holding. She touched his good shoulder. "Thorn." He woke instantly, his eyes clear. He looked at her, then at his shoulder, then around the small room. He moved, testing his body. He grunted, the pain still sharp, but he sat up, I can stand. He said it was a statement of fact, a victory. He stood, his legs unsteady, his bad arm held stiffly against his chest. Maris packed their few belonging. She helped him put on his ruined coat, the garment a testament to what they had survived. She opened the door. The world was transformed. A dazzling, pristine expanse of white, the snow, no longer an enemy, lay like a carpet of shattered silver on every branch and rock. The air was sharp, cold, and clean. The roan mare, patient as a stone, was standing exactly where she had been, her coat dusted with white. Thorn, leaning heavily on Maris, walked to the horse. He could not pull himself up. Maris cupped her hands, and he used her as a brace, swinging his good leg over the saddle. He sat, pale and rigid, but he was mounted. Maris put her foot in the stirrup, and he hauled her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her body a shield for his back, her hands careful to avoid his injured side. "Red Willow," he said, his voice quiet, but full of iron. He turned the horse, and they rode out, their single set of tracks cutting a new, clean line through the untouched, silver snow. The Red Willow District Courthouse was not a grand hall of justice. It was a simple, sturdy building of cut stone and timber, smelling of oiled wood, damp wool, and the faint, metallic scent of the law. The air inside was thick with the heat of 100 bodies crammed into the pews, a silent, expectant audience drawn from every corner of the county. They were here for the show, but also for the truth. Their lives, their land, their futures were all tied to the outcome of this hearing. At the head of the room, behind a massive oak bench, sat Judge Ephraim Locke. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the mountains, with a face like a weathered rockfall and eyes that held the cold, clear light of impartial justice. He was known for his sharp mind, his impatience with theatrics, and his unyielding adherence to the letter of the law. Thorn and Maris sat at a small table to the left of the bench. Thorn's left arm was in a sling, his coat draped awkwardly over his shoulders, his face pale but set like granite. Maris sat beside him, her hands clasped in her lap. She was not the same woman who had arrived in Cinder Valley weeks ago. The hunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. Across the aisle, Silas Bray sat with his lawyer, a portly, slick man from Boone Hollow named Hargrove. Bray was immaculate in a tailored suit, his handsome face composed, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. He looked less like a man facing a hearing and more like a landowner inspecting a property he was about to acquire. Judge Locke banged his gavel, the sound a sharp, definitive crack that silenced the last of the whispers. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice a low rumble. "This is a preliminary hearing to review a series of civil complaints regarding land acquisition practices in the Cinder Valley and surrounding territories, and to address the related, and I must say, highly irregular, arrest of one Mrs. Maris Ellison, Mr. Graves. You may begin." The district attorney, a young, earnest man named Elias Graves, stood. "Your Honor, the complainants will show a pattern of intimidation, forged documents, and a series of suspicious accidents, all designed to force homesteaders from their land that was subsequently purchased for a fraction of its worth by the Frontier Development Company, a corporation represented solely by Mr. Silas Bray. Hearsay and conjecture, Your Honor." Hargrove, Bray's lawyer, boomed, already on his feet. "Noted. Mr. Hargrove, sit down," the judge said without looking at him. "Mr. Graves, present your evidence." "I call Maris Ellison to the stand." A low murmur went through the crowd. Maris stood, her legs steady, and walked to the witness box. After being sworn in, she sat, her back straight. "Mrs. Ellison," Graves began, Can you tell the court about a certain ledger you came to possess from the saloon in Tin Lantern?" "Objection!" Hargrove shouted. "The fire at that saloon is a matter of an ongoing arson investigation, and this woman is the primary suspect. She has not been charged, Mr. Hargrove." The judge countered, his eyes narrowing. "Therefore, she is, in the eyes of this court, an innocent citizen. Your objection is overruled. Proceed, Mr. Graves." Maris recounted the story of the ledger, her voice clear and even. Then Graves said, "Your Honor, I would like to present a second document, recovered from the private office of Mr. Bray by Mr. Thorne Ellison." He held up the oilcloth-bound book. Hargrove was on his feet again. "Illegally obtained evidence. This is inadmissible." "Was a crime committed in the acquisition of this book, Mr. Ellison?" the judge asked, his gaze shifting to Thorne. "A man was attempting to murder my wife and myself, Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice flat. "I subdued him and removed this book from his employer's property. I considered it an act of self-preservation." "The court will allow it," Judge Locke decided, his expression unreadable. He instructed the bailiff to bring both books to the bench. For a long, silent minute, the judge examined them, his finger tracing the lines of script. He then took a third set of documents from Graves, a stack of official freight invoices for railroad supplies, all bearing Silas Bray's florid signature. He laid them side by side. "The handwriting," the judge murmured, almost to himself. "The spiky, angular script in the saloon ledger's margins, the hand that wrote this oilcloth book, and the signature on these official invoices. They appear to be one and the same." A wave of hushed excitement passed through the courtroom. Silas Bray's smile had vanished. But his lawyer was not finished. Hargrove approached the witness stand, his own smile a smug, unpleasant thing. "Mrs. Ellison," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You are an unmarried woman, a transient, who finds herself in a convenient marriage to a wealthy rancher immediately after fleeing the scene of a suspicious fire, a fire at your place of employment, where you had access and opportunity. Now you produce this fantasy." He gestured dismissively at the oilcloth book. "This convenient narrative that paints you as a victim. Isn't it more likely, Mrs. Ellison, that you set that fire to cover your own theft of the saloon's accounts, and that this entire elaborate story is a fabrication to save your own skin?" Maris flinched. The lie was so direct, so poisonous, it felt like a physical blow. "No," she said, her voice a whisper. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Hargrove pressed, moving closer. "Isn't it true that you are a desperate woman who would do anything to escape justice?" Before Maris could answer, the main doors at the back of the courthouse creaked open, letting in a shaft of bright, cold light. A bailiff moved to close them, but stopped. Framed in the doorway stood two men. One was a tall, lean man in buckskins, his face weathered, an antelope rifle held loosely in his hand. The other, leaning heavily on the hunter's arm, was a frail, old man with a familiar wrinkled face and wild white hair. His eyes, once vacant and lost, were now sharp and clear. It was the mail rider. "Your Honor," the hunter said, his voice rough but respectful. "Found this man wandering up in the high country. Took a bad fall, but his head's clear now. Says he has testimony for this court." Judge Locke stared at the old man for a long moment. "Let him approach." Hargrove's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. The old man, helped by the hunter, made his slow, painful way to the witness stand. He was sworn in, his hand trembling slightly on the Bible. "Sir," Judge Locke said, his voice softer than before, "state your name for the record." Amos Cartwright," the old man said, his voice reedy but clear. "I ride the mail." "Mr. Cartwright," Graves said gently, "do you recognize anyone in this courtroom?" Amos Cartwright scanned the room. His eyes passed over Maris, then Thorne. Then they fell on Silas Bray. A flicker of recognition and of fear lit his face. He lifted a trembling finger. "Him," he said. "That one, the railroad man. What do you know of this man, Mr. Cartwright?" "He's a thief," the old man said simply. "I seen his work, papers that looked real but weren't, grazing permits for land that was already owned, mining claims that didn't exist. He'd show 'em to folks, scare 'em into selling, and if they didn't scare..." The old man's gaze became distant, haunted. "Accidents would happen. Did you ever see him leave a sign, a mark of his work?" Graves asked, his voice tense. "Aye." Cartwright nodded. "A signal, for when the work was done. When the goods had been moved. He'd cut it into a tree, 3 little lines, straight down, like this." He held up 3 gnarled fingers. It was the mark on the hawthorn tree. It was the proof that linked the conspiracy together. Bray was on his feet, his face pale with rage, but his lawyer pulled him back down, whispering furiously in his ear. "This is the testimony of a senile old man," Hargrove shouted. "He's addled." "Your Honor!" A voice cut through the noise. It was Thorne. He had not stood, but his voice carried through the entire room. "I request permission to speak." "Mr. Ellison, this is highly irregular," the judge said, though his eyes showed a flicker of interest. "You are not an officer of the court." "No, sir. I am the husband of the woman who was illegally abducted by a corrupt deputy in the pay of Mr. Bray." The room erupted. Judge Locke hammered his gavel. Order, Mr. Ellison. You will explain that statement now." Thorne, with Maris's help, rose to his feet, his face a tight mask of pain. He told the court everything: the false warrant for obstruction, the secret prisoner transfer in Crow's Trough. He described the buggy, Yarrow's haste, and the planned destination at the privately owned land office. "Deputy Yarrow was not transporting a prisoner, Your Honor," Thorne concluded, his voice ringing with cold fury. "He was delivering a hostage, to be held until she signed a false confession that would have covered Mr. Bray's crimes and sent an innocent woman to prison." "Where is this Deputy Yarrow now?" Judge Locke demanded. "In your custody, I believe." Thorne said, "He was indisposed after he attempted to shoot me. I left him for the Boone Hollow Marshal to find." Judge Locke conferred with a clerk, who scurried from the room. A few minutes later, the side door to the courtroom opened, and Crane Yarrow was brought in, his hands manacled. His face was a ruin of bruises, his jaws swollen and wired shut. His eyes were wild with fear. He was placed before the bench. Judge Locke stared down at him, his face a thundercloud. "Deputy Yarrow," the judge's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "You have heard the testimony of Mr. Ellison. You have heard the testimony of Mr. Cartwright. You are an officer of the law, sworn to uphold it. I am giving you one chance, and one chance only, to speak the truth. Did you take money from Silas Bray in exchange for securing a false confession from Mrs. Ellison?" Yarrow looked from the judge's merciless face to Bray, who was now staring at him with undisguised venom. Yarrow looked at Thorne, at the sling, and at the cold promise in his eyes. He broke. He couldn't speak, but he nodded, a frantic, desperate bobbing of his head. "Yes, yes." The courtroom exploded into a roar of outrage. It was one thing to cheat a man out of his land. It was another to buy the law itself. In the chaos, no one was watching Silas Bray. He moved like a snake, silent and fast. He did not run for the main doors. He lunged for the small, private door behind the witness box that led to the judge's chambers, and from there to the alley. But the bailiff, a big, slow-moving man named Cobb, who had seemed half asleep for the entire proceeding, was suddenly, shockingly fast. He moved with the speed of a charging bear, his big body intercepting Bray in a flying tackle that sent both men crashing into the witness stand, shattering the wooden railing. Bray fought like a cornered animal, kicking and clawing. As Cobb struggled to pin his arms, something small and metallic flew from Bray's coat pocket, skittering across the polished wooden floor. It came to a stop at the foot of the judge's bench. It was a brass percussion cap, a blasting cap, the kind used to detonate dynamite. The room went dead silent. Every eye was on the small, deadly object glinting in the light. It was the final, irrefutable link. It was the physical proof of the explosions, the accidents, the reign of terror. Bailiff Cobb finally subdued Bray, hauling him to his feet. Bray's mask of civility was gone, his face a twisted, snarling mask of pure hatred. Judge Ephraim Locke stood, his face carved from ice. He pointed his gavel at Bray. "Silas Bray!" he boomed, his voice shaking the very timbers of the building. "You are hereby remanded into custody, without possibility of bail, to await arraignment on charges of fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, and illegal possession of explosives. Get him out of my sight." As Bray was dragged, still struggling, from the courtroom, Judge Locke turned his gaze to Maris. The room was so quiet she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. "Mrs. Maris Ellison," the judge said, his voice now quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. "In light of the testimony presented here today, and the confession of Deputy Yarrow, this court finds that the accusations against you were made maliciously and without merit. The warrant for your arrest was obtained under false pretenses. Therefore, all charges, suspicions, and investigations against you related to the events in Tin Lantern are hereby and forever dismissed. You are free to go." The finality of the words washed over her. A physical wave of relief so profound her knees went weak. The weight she had carried for months, the fear, the shame, the constant looking over her shoulder, it was gone. Thorne reached out with his good hand and squeezed her arm. A small, grounding pressure. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not just relief, but a fierce, burning pride. He winced, a slight, involuntary movement, and his hand went to his bandaged shoulder. A subtle, unconscious reminder of the price they had paid. Maris saw the movement. She saw the pain that flickered across his face. And she stood. She stood taller than she ever had in her life. Her back was straight. Her shoulders were square. She was no longer hiding behind him. She was standing beside him, his equal. Her name as clean and as bright as the new fallen snow. The journey home from Red Willow was a silent one, measured by the heavy thud of the draft horse's hooves on the packed snow. They were not on horseback. Thorne, his left arm bound tightly in a sling, his shoulder a landscape of agony beneath the bandage, was in no shape to ride. The district judge, seeing his condition, had arranged for them to take a sturdy buckboard wagon from the town livery, with a promise to have one of his men retrieve it later. Maris drove. Her hands, steady on the reins, were the same hands that had stitched his flesh back together. Thorne sat beside her, his good arm braced against the wagon's side, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The hard-won victory in the courthouse felt distant, a fragile, brittle thing. The air was cold, but the sky was a deep, clear, unforgiving blue. They were free. His name had cleared hers, but the cost was written on his body, and the shadow of Silas Bray and his organization still felt long. They made their way into the high country, following the trail that would lead them down into Cinder Valley. The pass was a narrow, treacherous cut through a formation of jagged, iron-red spires known as the Seven Needles. It was the only direct route, a bottleneck where the world narrowed to a single, winding track, cliffs rising on one side and a sheer, rocky drop-off on the other. They were halfway through the pass, the wagon wheels crunching on the icy gravel. when the fragile peace of the afternoon exploded. It was not a boom. It was a high-velocity crack, sharp and flat, that echoed, magnified, off the stone walls. It was the sound of a modern repeating rifle. Instinct, raw and immediate, took over. Before Maris could even process the sound, before she could identify the whine of the bullet that followed, Thorn was moving. "Down," he roared. He did not just push her. With his one good arm, he lunged, his entire body a shield, his shoulders slamming into her ribs. He threw her from the wagon seat, a desperate, protective heave that sent her tumbling into the rough, snow-covered grasses at the side of the narrow track. She landed hard, the air driven from her lungs, just as the second shot rang out. This one was not a warning. The bullet hit the thick oak side panel of the wagon, precisely where Thorn's head had been a second before. The wood exploded inward. Thorn cried out, a sharp, choked sound. He fell back, clutching his good arm, his right arm, a long, wicked, dagger-like splinter of oak, thrown by the bullet's impact, was embedded deep in his forearm. The horses, screaming in terror, reared and bolted. The reins were ripped from Maris's hands. The buckboard lurched, slammed against the rock wall, and then careened, driverless, down the pass, taking their supplies, their blankets, and their only way home with it. "Thorn!" Maris scrambled to him. He was on his knees, his face ashen, blood welling up around the shard of wood. He was now doubly wounded, his good arm compromised. "The carbine," he gritted out, his eyes scanning the rocks above them. She looked. When he had thrown her, she had instinctively grabbed the one thing that had been resting between them on the seat, the light Winchester carbine he had insisted she learn to use. It was still clutched in her right hand. "The rocks, move," he ordered. Above them, on the cliff face, she saw movement. Three men, working their way down, rifles in hand, Bray's men, the ones who had not been at the courthouse. She grabbed Thorn, hauling him to his feet. He staggered, his breath hissing in pain. They scrambled, half falling, half crawling, behind a low, thick bastion of fallen boulders, a natural hollow in the rock that offered meager cover. "They're coming," she whispered, her heart a frantic drum. "Load it," he commanded, his voice strained. He pulled his own pistol with his left hand, but he was clumsy, his movements awkward. Maris fumbled with the carbine, her hands shaking. She thumbed cartridges into the loading gate. She remembered his lessons. Breathe. Don't fight it. Let the machine work. The first attacker was exposed, moving between boulders 50 yards away. He was confident, not bothering to hide, expecting 2 easy targets. "Warning," Thorn gasped, trying to aim his pistol left-handed. "Just keep their heads down." Maris rested the long barrel of the carbine on the flat top of the boulder. She took a breath. She remembered the fall from Sage, the feel of the trigger, the patience of his voice. She aimed not at the man, but at the rock face 2 feet to his left. She squeezed the trigger. The carbine jumped against her shoulder, the sound a sharp, definitive answer to the attacker's rifles. The bullet screamed off the rock, spalling stone chips that struck the man in the face. He cried out in surprise and dove for cover. "Good," Thorn breathed beside her. Again, a second man appeared, trying to get a better angle. Maris shifted, found her target, and fired. This time she aimed at the ground just in front of him, kicking up a plume of snow and gravel. He, too, retreated. "You're doing it, Maris," Thorn said, his voice laced with a pained, fierce pride. "You're holding them." She was. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by a blade of icy resolve. She was no longer the one being hunted. She was the one protecting. She was the shield. Now, she reloaded, her movements becoming smoother, more economical. For 10 minutes, A deadly stalemate held. Every time an attacker showed himself, she sent a bullet whining near him, keeping them pinned, buying them precious, desperate seconds. Then Thorn, his gaze scanning the high ridge, stiffened. "They're flanking. 2 of them. To the right. They're climbing up. To get above us." Maris felt a cold dread wash over her. She was good, but she couldn't watch 2 directions at once. They were trapped. The men below were just a distraction while the others moved in for the kill. She fired one more shot at the men below, but she knew it was hopeless. It was then that a new sound cut through the pass. It was not a gunshot. It was a high, ululating cry, a sound that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the sky. "What is that?" Maris whispered, her eyes wide. Thorn was staring at the high ridge, above the flanking attackers. "Shoshone!" he breathed. 3 riders appeared, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. They were not dressed like the white men below. They were on fast, agile ponies, their bodies lean, their rifles seeming to grow from their hands. They were the masters of this rock, the true owners of this pass. The flanking attackers, who had been so focused on the prey below, looked up in stunned disbelief before they could even raise their rifles. The 3 Shoshone riders fired as one. Their shots were not warnings. One of the attackers pitched forward, his rifle clattering down the rocks. The other, wounded, screamed and began a desperate, sliding scramble back down. The tables had not just been turned, they had been shattered. The men in the rocks below, seeing their support vanish, seeing the new deadly threat from above, panicked. They broke cover and ran. A disorganized, clumsy retreat back to where their horses were tied. The Shoshone riders descended the cliff face with a speed that seemed impossible, their ponies navigating the scree like mountain goats. One of the riders, younger than the others, let out a whoop and gave chase, a lariat already spinning in his hand. As the last attacker tried to mount his horse, the loop settled perfectly around his shoulders, and he was yanked from the saddle, crashing hard onto the icy ground. The other 2 attackers managed to ride off, disappearing down the pass in a spray of snow. The 3 riders approached the hollow, their rifles held in a position of casual readiness. The leader was an older man, his face a map of the mountains, his eyes sharp and assessing. He looked at Thorn, at the blood on his good arm, at the sling on his other. He looked at Maris, at the carbine she still held. Thorn, using the rock, pushed himself to his feet. He held up his bleeding right hand, palm out, in the universal gesture of peace, splintered in his forearm. The Shoshone leader's eyes narrowed, then widened in recognition. "Ellison, man," the rider said. His English was halting, thick with the rhythm of his own tongue. "You are Ellison, man?" Thorn nodded, the pain making him unsteady. We are in your debt." The rider dismounted, approaching Thorn. He looked at the blood, then back at the younger rider, who was now tying the hands of their captive. "Last snow," the older man said. "You find horse for my son." He gestured to the young, skilled rider. "Eagle's wing." Thorn nodded. A flicker of memory. A young Shoshone hunter. His horse taken by a disreputable hide trader in Copper Vale over a supposed debt. He needed his horse. Thorn said simply, "I paid the trader. It was nothing." "It was not nothing," the leader said, his gaze hard. "It was honor. We saw the ambush from the high ridge. We repay. A debt is a debt." The captured man, one of Bray's hired guns, was dragged forward. He was terrified, his eyes wide. "Where were the others going?" Thorn demanded, walking toward him, his face a mask of cold fury. The man spat. Eagle's wing, the young rider, stepped forward and placed the flat of his knife against the man's throat. The man froze. "Talk," Thorn ordered. "Gallows Wash," the man blurted out, his bravado gone. We were supposed to meet the others at Gallows Wash, all of us. That's all I know, I swear. Gallows Wash, a dead-end canyon 20 miles east. The final rat's nest. The Shoshone leader looked at Thorne, then gestured with his rifle toward the pass. "We will hunt them. Finish this." Thorne looked at the long, bloody splinter in his arm. He looked at Maris, who was pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the carbine. He saw the trauma in her eyes, the exhaustion that went bone deep. He looked at the long, cold road that still lay between them and Cinder Valley. He had spent months driven by a cold need for justice, for a reckoning. Now, seeing the final thread of the conspiracy, he felt nothing, only a profound, aching need to be home. "No," Thorne said, his voice quiet but final. He turned to the Shoshone leader. "My fight is over. My wife is safe. That is all that matters." He looked at the prisoner. "Take him to Red Willow. Give him to the law. He is your catch." The leader held his gaze, then nodded, a gesture of deep, mutual respect. They helped Thorne pull the splinter from his arm, a fresh, agonizing burst of pain. They gave Maris a strip of clean leather to bind it. They offered them 2 of the captured horses. The ride home was a blur of exhaustion and pain. They arrived as the last, fragile light of dusk painted the snow-covered peaks a pale, bruised purple. The cabin was dark. It was silent. It had never looked so beautiful. Later, much later, they sat on the porch. He had built a fire, and the cabin glowed with warmth behind them. Maris had cleaned and rebandaged both of his wounds, her touch gentle, her face grim. Now, they sat wrapped in thick wool blankets, watching the night. The world was utterly still. A few dry flakes of snow had begun to fall, drifting down like soft, white ash from a spent fire. The storm, the real one and the one inside them, was finally over. Maris was quiet, her gaze on his bandaged left shoulder, the place where the bullet had torn through, the place her needle had mended. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and gently touched the scar, a faint, pale line just visible above the bandage. "Thorne," she whispered, her voice thick. "Thank you." The words were so small, so hopelessly inadequate for what he had done, for the name he had given her, for the body he had twice offered as a shield. "Maris," he said, his voice a low rumble in the cold, quiet air. He took her hand, the one that had fired the rifle, and held it in his own. His good hand, his right hand, now bandaged and stiff, he held her, his grip sure. He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat, the one she had mended. He pulled out something small, something that glinted in the faint, yellow light from the cabin window. It was a ring, a simple, thin band of old, worn gold. It was not new. It had the soft, deep glow of a thing that had been held and cherished for a lifetime. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were hard to find. "Before we left Red Willow, I had Mr. Gable, the blacksmith, resize it, while we were waiting." Her breath caught in her throat. He had known, before the ambush, before the final confrontation. He had known this was the outcome he wanted. He had planned for this, for her. He didn't ask a question. He didn't make a speech. He simply turned her hand over, his thumb brushing her calloused palm, and gently, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he slid the thin gold band onto the fourth finger of her left hand. It fit perfectly. Maris stared at it, this impossible solid circle of gold on her skin, a symbol of a life she had never dared to imagine. A hot, sharp tear escaped her, tracing a cold path down her cheek. He watched her, his gray eyes, so often stormy or cold with pain, now filled with a quiet, steady, and certain warmth. He lifted his bandaged hand, his fingers rough against her skin, and brushed the tear from her cheek. "If this is what they call love," he said, his voice a low murmur, A private sound meant only for her and the falling snow. Then let it be quiet, and let it last. Spring did not just arrive in Cinder Valley. It poured in, a torrent of liquid gold and green that broke the iron grip of winter. It was a season of resurrection. The snow, which had been a shroud, retreated up the slopes of Antler Mesa, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The ice on Larkspur Creek, the one they had ridden beside, shattered and flowed, its voice a cheerful, rushing sound, a stark contrast to the silence of the blizzard. The air, once sharp enough to cut, was now soft, smelling of damp soil, new grass, and the sweet, resinous tang of budding pine. It was a time for new beginnings. The old Ellison Ranch, the one that had belonged to Thorne's father, the one that had been his sanctuary and Maris's prison, was too full of ghosts. It held the memory of his first wife, of his long solitude, and of the fear that had brought Maris to his door. With the money from the sale of his horse herd to the army, a contract secured with the help of the Red Willow judge, they had bought a small parcel of land. It was her choice. He had taken her there, to a gentle slope that ran down to the banks of Larkspur Creek. It was a place where the grass grew thick and green, sheltered by a stand of towering firs, and the sky was a vast, open bowl, wide as a promise. She had stood there, the spring breeze pulling at her hair, and had simply said, "Here." And so they began to build. Their life was a new rhythm, a shared labor that was a kind of quiet, constant conversation. The house was not a grand one, but it was theirs, every log and every joint. They worked from sunup to sundown, the sounds of their creation filling the air, the sharp, rhythmic zing of Thorne's cross-cut saw, the steady thwack chunk of his axe as he hewed the logs flat, the scrape of the draw knife as he peeled the bark. His strength, which had once been a silent, intimidating force, was now a tool for their shared future. He would lift the massive green timber beams for the roof, his muscles straining, his shoulder, now healed into a puckered silver scar, taking the weight without complaint. And Maris worked beside him. She was not a passive observer. She learned to use the tools he taught her, her hands, already strong, becoming deft. She found her skill in the details. While he set the foundations, she chinked the logs, her fingers forcing the mixture of mud, straw, and moss into every gap, sealing their home against the wind. Her greatest pride was the joinery. He taught her how to use the chisel and mallet, and she was the one who carved the mortises, the neat, rectangular holes that would accept the tenons of the cross beams. It was precise, demanding work. She would be lost in it for hours, the light thock-thock-thock of her mallet a counter-rhythm to his heavier blows. One afternoon, she was so focused on a difficult corner joint, her tongue stuck out in concentration, that she didn't hear him approach. He stood watching her, this woman who had once been a terrified stranger, now the architect of his home. A dusting of fine, pale fur sawdust covered her dark hair, glinting like pollen in the golden, late afternoon light. He reached out his good hand, the one with the faint, white scars from the splintered wagon, and gently brushed the sawdust from her hair. She started, looking up at him, her face smudged with dirt. "You've got a little house," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. She saw the sawdust in his palm, then reached up and touched her own hair, her face breaking into a wide, easy smile. She laughed, a sound as clear and as bright as the creek, and then, using her own dusty hand, she reached up and rubbed a matching smudge of sawdust onto his nose. "So do you." He didn't smile, not his old, rare, brief smile. He laughed, a real deep laugh that came from his chest, a sound she had never heard. It was the sound of a man who was, for the first time in a long time, completely and utterly happy. This was their language. It was built of small, solid things. It was the fence line they ran together, Maris holding the cedar posts steady while Thorne tamped the earth around them. It was the garden she planted, her hands in the rich soil, setting out rows of beans and squash. It was the small, sweet honey cakes she baked in their new, properly sealed stone hearth, a taste of comfort and home that replaced the memory of burnt, salvaged cornbread. These small, repeated acts of labor and care, day after day, were the bricks and mortar of their life. The house was finished by the time the wildflowers carpeted the meadow, a riot of blue lupine, yellow balsam root, and delicate, white spring beauties. The air was thick with their perfume. One night, the moon was so bright it was almost day, a perfect silver disk in a sea of stars. The air was warm, the breeze a soft, fragrant whisper from the south. "It's too beautiful to be inside," Maris said, her voice soft. He didn't answer in words. He simply took the thick wool blanket from their new bed, the one he had built with his own hands, and led her outside. He spread it on the soft grass, not far from the bank of the creek. The water's rushing sound was a constant, soothing shh, a lullaby for the valley. They lay down side by side, their hands linked, staring up at the impossible, depthless sky. For a long time, they were silent, just two small, warm figures in a vast, peaceful world. The moon was so bright it bleached the color from the landscape, painting it in shades of silver and deep, soft black. Maris turned her head, her hair spilling over the blanket. She looked at his profile, the strong, familiar line of his jaw, the way the moonlight caught the scar he would carry forever. "Thorn," she said, her voice barely louder than the creek. He rumbled, his gaze still on the stars. "I still don't know how to be a wife." He turned his head then, his gray eyes catching the silver light. They were no longer stormy, or cold, or filled with pain. They were clear and deep, and filled with an emotion so profound it made her breath catch. "I told you," he whispered, his voice rough with a tenderness she had come to crave. "I don't need a book." He leaned over her, his body a familiar, welcome shadow that blocked out the sky. He did not rush. He was the same man who had mended her boots with such care, the same man who had waited for her to lead the kiss in the stable. He was giving her time, giving her space, even now. She met him halfway, lifting her face to his. The kiss was not the desperate, clinging act of two survivors in a snowstorm. It was not the hesitant, exploratory touch of two strangers in a stable. This was a kiss of belonging. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a kiss that said, "You are home. This is where you belong. You are safe." He pulled her closer, his arms strong around her. His hand, the scarred one, came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with a reverence that made her heart ache. She smelled him, the clean scent of lye soap, the faint, honest smell of sawdust and leather, the scent of the man she loved. They moved slowly, their hands relearning paths they already knew by heart. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the smooth, beloved skin where she had once shaved his beard. She felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart through his shirt, the same rhythm that had been her anchor in the dark. His hands moved over her, not with demand, but with a gentle, guiding touch. It was a question, a reassurance, a promise. There was no hurry to remove clothing. Their intimacy was not a fire. It was a deep, flowing warmth, like the center of the hearth. It was the whisper of their breath, his name on her lips, her name on his. It was the profound, unspoken trust that allowed them to be this close, this vulnerable, under the eye of the moon. It was the simple, sacred act of being present, of holding and being held, every touch bounded by a soft, unspoken wall of safety and absolute respect. It was a quiet, certain confirmation of the vow she had made with her forehead pressed to his in the cinder post station. "I am here, I will stay." And after, they lay tangled in the blanket, her head on his good shoulder, his arms a second, living home around her. They didn't speak, They just watched the stars, which seemed to be spinning, slowly, just for them. The world was vast, but it had shrunk to this one perfect, quiet moment. Maris lifted her left hand, the one he held against his chest. In the moonlight, the old, thin band of gold glinted. It was not a perfect, shiny new ring. It was worn smooth in places, a testament to a long-past life, a different love, but it had been mended, resized, made to fit her. It was imperfect. It was scarred. It was, she thought, just like them. It wasn't a perfect storybook beginning. It was real, and it had been forged in fear and fire, mended with blood and trust, and it fit. The love that had settled in their new home was not a loud, declarative thing. It was not the stuff of poems or grand promises. It was the quiet, steady sound of his breathing in the dark. It was the shared, easy laugh over a smudge of sawdust. It was the simple, profound knowledge that they were, both of them, finally and completely, safe. The love was there. It was quiet, and it was built to last. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with our audience, so please let us know in the comments where you're listening from today and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.